Simon Cameron, the First Lord of the Star League, was dead. While we may celebrate the Star League as our cultural epoch and lament its downfall, just how much of a fabled utopia was it really?
Like all things sold on the basis of purity, it was lacking, and in time, engineered its own destruction.
The fall of the Star League was nothing short of a catastrophe, a catalyst that will change the inner sphere irrevocably.
It was the end of Terran imperialism, the end of Pax Terrana, and the beginning of unbridled greed, chaos, and destruction.
The death of the First Lord, Simon Cameron, is one of the great mysteries of the Inner Sphere. Everyone knows the circumstances of his death were indeed suspicious, but just who perpetrated the crime will likely never be uncovered. Most people now assume it was the leader of the Rimworld's Republic who orchestrated the events that led to the ascension of his son Richard Cameron, but we cannot discount the possibility of the other great houses having a hand in the events on Star's End, or even members of House Cameron itself. Many stood to gain power and influence with the removal of the First Lord, and so the debate of who was responsible will likely continue for centuries more to come.
When First Lord Simon Cameron was killed on New Silesia in February 2751, it pushed the Star League, which was already teetering on a knife edge, down into the abyss. Even today, over 250 years removed from the incident, people still debate on who was to blame for what happened. Certainly we can point to who gained the most, but it would be presumptuous to declare that it was definitely them who had masterminded the assassination. Opinion is divided, but there are several likely candidates. A common belief at the time was that it was anti-Star League extremists from the Periphery Freedom Movement, likely hailing from the Tordean Concordat. Another theory was that he was murdered by a mining consortium after he was rumoured to be giving an endorsement to zero-G robotic asteroid excavation, potentially costing traditional planet-based mines trillions of C-bills in revenue. Few believed that the Rimworld's Republic was behind the attack, as they were, on the surface, the most loyal of the Periphery nations, being the only one that had not tolerated the PFM, and so stood little to gain from the attack. History would soon prove that last part wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the Amaris family was responsible. House Steiner had been embarrassed by the First Lord's peace tour through their realm, and his efforts to sidestep the Lyran nobility while talking directly to the common people. Still, the Archon had a reasonably positive rapport with Simon, and seems unlikely to have given such a vindictive order. The most probable candidate, and certainly one with the means to perform such a task, is House Kurita. 150 years of escalating tension between the two had made it almost inevitable that something extreme was going to happen. As a nation that historically keeps a very firm control over their population, and also being Simon Cameron's next destination in his tour, it's indeed possible that they chose to eliminate him ahead of time. Ultimately though, the Draconis Combine has never claimed responsibility despite centuries of open aggression since, so we will likely never know for certain. To understand why events unfolded the way they did over the next 15 years, we first need to understand the individuals who comprise the ruling High Council, whose decisions would shape the final chapter of the Star League. If you were to compare them to the idealistic and largely principled heads of state at the founding of the Star League, it's no wonder that it all ultimately fell apart. The most senior among them was Coordinator Takiro Kurita of the Draconis Combine. Like his predecessors Siruan and Urizen II, he was blessed with a long life, and was over 100 years old by this point. His attitude remained strongly anti-Star League following his defeat during the War of Davian Succession. Their longtime rivals, the Federated Sons, was now ruled by First Prince John Davian, who had inherited a realm in the process of moving away from its dependency on the League. While he was one of the less contentious among the Council Lords, he was of the opinion that the League was only useful if it directly benefited his own realm. Their periphery neighbour, the Outworlds Alliance, was ruled by the puritanical President Beatrice Avalar, whose beliefs often made her distant or difficult to deal with. On the opposite side of the Federated Sons, Protector Nicoletta Calderon hunted for any opportunity that might allow the Taurian Concordat to break away. Werex Liao was the last of the so-called Sunderman Liaos, and was a cautious and somewhat surly ruler for the Capellan Confederation. Venura Centrella had never settled into her role as the Magistrates of Canopus, and had a reputation for stubbornness and poor political appointments. The most abrasive man on the council was Captain General Ewan Marek of the Free Worlds League, whose brash and offensive manner made him the bane of just about everyone unfortunate enough to encounter him. He was no more popular within his own realm, his son Kenyon being a rallying point for the opposition. Were it not for the fact that no one wanted to see a repeat of the civil war just past, then Ewan might have been forced out. Michael Steiner II, Archon of the Lyran Commonwealth, had to endure more than most when it came to Ewan's outbursts, mostly for his behaving like a military fop. The Terran hegemony would continue in the capable hands of Director General and President of the Terran Congress, Jens Pinera. Lastly, but certainly not least, was the man who would go on to define the final 30 years of the Star League, President of the Rimworld's Republic, Stefan Amaris. It was his delight to confound the others on whether he was pro or anti-Star League, the true answer to which would become horrifyingly clear before the end of the next decade. This was the nest of vipers that the young Richard Cameron fell into when his father died. On April 3rd, 2751, he was confirmed in his position as First Lord of the Star League, but on account of being only 8 years old, a regent would be elected to rule in his stead. In a rare moment of agreement, the Council Lords chose as regent the Commanding General of the Star League Defense Force, Alexander Kerensky.
Of all the great military generals, none are as revered as Alexander Kerensky of the Star League Defense Force. His influence altered the course of human history in uncountable ways and spared our civilization from terrible atrocities. Though deified in later centuries, like many celebrated wartime leaders, his talent for peacetime statecraft was somewhat lacking, creating opportunities that others around him were quick to exploit.
Kerensky had first made a name for himself during the tail end of the First Hidden War as one of the SLDF's gunslingers. From there, he went on to distinguish himself further during the Second Hidden War through his participation in Operation Smother. Many of those who served alongside him now held positions of high command. With the exception of the Archon, who had met a young Alexander studying history at Tharkad University, he first came to the attention of the Council Lords as a troublemaker out in the Concordat, who was fighting against the member state-backed economic corruption that was rife at that point in time. To remove the annoyance, the High Council promoted him to a staff position on Terra, and from there up to his predecessor's aide. After her retirement in 2739, he was a natural choice to take over as Commanding General, leading the Star League military through the Third Hidden War. The fact that the Council Lords chose someone so decorated and morally upstanding, while simultaneously being beyond their control as the head of the independent SLDF, might at first seem surprising, but it was this last point in particular that made him so appealing. Upon hearing the news, Kerensky naturally went to resign as commanding general, but was talked into retaining his post as it was deemed he was irreplaceable at that time of growing periphery tension. There was a definite element of truth to that, as he had spent his years in command trimming the fat within the SLDF, and there was really no one who knew the inner workings of the armed forces as well as he did. Nevertheless, Alexander found it near impossible to perform both his new duties as protector of the realm and his prior role within the military. This left the actual governance of the Star League to the remaining council lords. They wasted little time before pushing through legislation that any prior First Lord would never have stood for. In 2752, the High Council passed an amendment to the Council Edict of 2650, effectively removing the restraints that had limited the overall size of the individual house militaries. And to pay for this expansion in arms, they introduced new taxes aimed at the territorial states, who would foot the bill but see none of the benefits. Surviving documents from the era give us a rare insight into the comparative strength of the various house militaries in the year 2750. If we look first at the situation pre-reunification war in 2575 and contrast it to how things were post-war at the turn of the century, the most obvious change is the devastated periphery armies and navies. The three belligerent members of the ISP were never allowed to increase the size of their armed forces following this conflict. The Rimwell's Republic's sudden expansion a century prior had inadvertently caused a rebalance of power across the League. Though they only had to disband a handful of their new units, still retaining a larger RWA than they had started with, Directive 30 had the most dramatic effect on the Innisphere Great Houses. 100 years later, even the illegal increase seen during the Third Hidden War had not significantly impacted their numbers. Since then, the RWA, now under the command of General Jasmin Amaris, had negotiated for an even larger military. What perhaps slipped the minds of the Council Lords when they repealed Directive 30 was that the Rimwells too now had free rein to expand their arsenal, though this seemed of little concern at the time. The SLDF had expanded steadily ever since its inception, and in 2752 outnumbered all of them put together. It was an advantage that they wouldn't maintain for very much longer. Between 2750 and 2765, the size of the house militaries effectively doubled. The biggest gains were made by the Draconis Combine Mustered Soldiery. The Free Wills League military, which had been the strongest of the member states, saw its advantage slip away as they produced the fewest numbers of new mechs. It's worth noting that the battle mech forces were one of the things most tightly restricted by the Council Edict of 2650. The disparity between the SLDF and the rest of the Innisphere at first seems enormous, but each member state was fielding as many as 1,000 conventional regiments for every 100 mech units, whereas the SLDF was split between mechs and conventional troops on a roughly 40-60 distribution. Within the Rimworlds, plans were being drawn up for an ambitious scheme that would hopefully rid the Republic of its Star League enforcers for good. From a young age, Stefan Amaris had been taught to secretly loathe the Star League. The slight done to his predecessor, Gregory Amaris, during the Reunification War had never been forgiven by the ruling family. The first consul had openly and frequently proclaimed public support for the League, and yet in his time of need, had been left to rot within his estate on Apollo, while dissidents kept him under siege for over 20 years. Stefan sought to even that score, and in the young First Lord Richard Cameron, he saw a means to achieving those ends. Amaris departed the Rimworlds and would not return for over 10 years. State-controlled Rimworlds media CEO Jericho Jaycox suggested that Stefan had more affinity for Earth than he did his own Republic, but this was all part of the act. Taking a page from Gregory's playbook, outwardly Amaris was the Star League's most avid proponent, but in truth, he sought to be rid of it. In March 2753, he arrived on Terra and introduced himself to the First Lord. Richard found this strange man from the periphery intriguing, and when he was presented with a tome of medieval legends and stories, a gift carefully selected to appeal to his interests, the foundation of a strong future friendship was established. Richard Cameron, now 10 years old, was above all else lonely. Both his parents were dead, he had no children his own age to socialise with, his supposed guardian Kerensky was never at court, the council lords used him or ignored him as needed, and his staff and retainers treated him coolly. It's perhaps no wonder that Amaris was so easily able to worm his way into Richard's circle of trust. The sad reality was that those around him were glad to be free from the responsibility of entertaining the tempestuous child, and so it was that Stefan became a father figure of sorts to the boy over the next 2 years. At his urging, Richard Cameron made a shocking debut appearance at the High Council session in October 2755. To honour his good friend's birthday, he first elevated Amaris to the position of Knight of the Star League, but then made the more surprising announcement that the SLDF would be withdrawn from the Rimworlds altogether on account of their interminable loyalty. The Council Lords assented, either through bemusement, confusion, or because they noticed that Alexander Kerensky was the first one who spoke against the move, and so saw an opportunity to drive a wedge between him and Cameron, thereby further mitigating the regent's power. In later years, Richard freely showered Amaris with gifts, even going so far as to construct him the Star Palace out in the Canadian Wilderlands. Kerensky continued to strenuously object to the so-called birthday proclamations for some time afterwards before he was finally forced to back down. 20th Army was borderline mutinous during these tense few years, but Kerensky gave strict orders to dismantle, destroy, or erase anything that might be used against the SLDF in the future. By 2757, they were moving for the border, the last divisions crossing over into the Lyran Commonwealth the following March. Unfortunately, across so many planets and facilities, the Rimworlds was able to collect a veritable treasure trove of information and military secrets. Two of the worst incidents involve Majors General Elliot Van Ness of the Bonnie Prince Charlie Division, who failed to wipe the memory core of their Hevrel aerobase, and Liam Garvey of the Pride of Cuba, who left most of Fort McHenry operationally intact. Both were relieved of command soon after. Incredibly, Amaris had achieved his goal of ridding his realm of the SLDF in just a handful of years. Buoyed by this victory, he remained on Earth, formulating new plans. Recognizing his shortcomings as regent, one last attempt was made by Kerensky to mend the divide between himself and the First Lord. Alexander invited him to observe Operation Persuasive Force in the spring of 2757. This exercise, ostensibly a mock campaign to both attack and defend the Terran hegemony, was in truth a thinly veiled warning to the increasingly belligerent member states that he was prepared to take action against them. It demonstrated just that. First Army showed that the hegemony could likely be defended against an aggressor 3 times their own size. The operation was also useful training for the seemingly inevitable clash with the periphery. Unfortunately, while Richard Cameron was fascinated with the military manoeuvres, any hope of building a relationship was scuppered. Cameron had come aboard Kerensky's flagship, the SLS McKenna's Pride, with a contingent from the Rimworlds, who the commanding general had spent the entire exercise trying to separate from the First Lord, sending them off to various locations within the fleet, so that they might share a private word. Those individuals were all too happy to poke their noses around the fleet and watch the action unfold. When Alexander suggested that Amaris might not be a true friend, Richard immediately rejected the idea and withdrew further from his regent.
Richard Cameron was a problem, just as the Camerons themselves were. They were a lever of power occupying the literal throne of Damocles. Occasionally swords fell on them, and in their position, that was expected. That a Cameron heralded the end of Star League is no wonder. One began it, after all. I do not find blame in Richard Cameron for his position in the line of his dynasty, or his age, or his inexperience. I do find issue, though, with his understanding of trust. He didn't learn one key lesson of rulership, in that those who agree with everything you think often will ask for something in return. By befriending an isolated Cameron, Amaris had little issue slowly enforcing a favorable status, and then a personal agenda. Richard Cameron's only sin was perhaps his foolish naivete and trust in what appeared to be a faithful ally, as he had never learned that nations have no friends, only interests.
The periphery by this point was a hotbed of civil unrest. Anti-Star League sentiment was at an all-time high, with much of this spurred on by state media. Director of the Taurian Propaganda Division, Madison Uncappa, was one of the most recognizable faces within the Concordat, and with Calderon's blessing, had whipped the populace into a near frenzy. Across the inner sphere, Jericho Jaycox was doing the same. Jericho was carefully towing the line between the loyalty expressed by Amaris and the feelings of his common citizens. He directed his attacks not at the Star League itself, but at its leadership, the Cameron Line and the unruly Council Lords. The military-industrial complex within the territorial states was also ramping up during this time. This was happening with the tacit approval of the SLDF, who was relying on several suppliers to keep their periphery armies operational. One such venture was Lushan Industrials within the Outworlds Alliance. Daniel Ladd's company, far from being technologically backward like the common outworld stereotype, had the most advanced laser manufacturing capabilities outside of the Terran hegemony, producing the new extended range and pulse lasers that otherwise were exclusive to the royal units within the SLDF. Freed from the same restrictions imposed by Directive 30, and with the High Council otherwise occupied looking at their Ionosphere neighbours, the militaries of the periphery were slowly expanding. On the surface, they were not keeping pace with the member states for fear of attracting an SLDF response, but they were each secretly constructing hidden facilities within their own realm, and beyond in the deep periphery. This was all the easier for the Rimworlds now that the SLDF had been withdrawn. Weapons manufacturers were receiving record profits all across the Star League, not just with the governments, but private concerns as well. However, it steadily became apparent that many of these purchases were happening through shell companies, and the weapons, vehicles and mechs were disappearing out into the periphery. This meant little to those corporations producing the goods, but was a serious worry for the SLDF.
The runaway military spending begun by Jonathan Cameron was something that his successor Simon was never able to reel in during his 13 years as First Lord. As the SLDF continued to grow in order to maintain the peace, it required an even greater arms industry to support it, which in turn only increased the proliferation of weapons among discontents. It was a deadly cycle that led to a destructive inevitability.
Behind the scenes, Amaris was hard at work building an alliance between himself and the other associate members. At first they were distrustful, believing him to be nothing but a sycophant and league catspaw, but when he promised them arms, even battle mechs, their mood soon shifted. While the Rimworlds was openly expanding their RWA to rival even the Ionosphere powers, Amaris had also secretly begun building another force that by 2760 already numbered 2 divisions. Tasked with the formation and training of this new secret army was one of the President's most trusted generals, Patrick Scoffins. Stefan had no shortage of sycophants, both in government and in the Rimworld's army, but in Scoffins he had a genuinely brilliant and loyal commander whose goals and beliefs aligned with his own. Patrick agreed that the Cameron family had done the periphery a great injustice and must in some way be made to pay. While Scoffins wasn't the first to be counted among Amaris's inner circle, he would become one of the elite 5 who were closest to the President. Most troubling for historians and those who wish to quickly characterise all those aligned with the Rimworlds as the villains of this chapter in human history, General Scoffins would show himself to be every bit as honest and principled as his counterpart in the SLDF. The secret army needed a source though, both of funding and material. With all legitimate efforts going into strengthening the RWA, Amaris needed a way to grow this force without drawing attention. He was the individual behind the shell companies placing those orders with the Ionosphere arms manufacturers. Once in possession of the goods, he transferred them out to staging posts within the deep periphery to hide them from the Star League. This came at an enormous personal cost to the Amaris family's stockpiled fortunes, but it was one Stefan was happy to pay. Amaris had found willing partners with the leadership of the other territorial states. He promised the periphery realms complete access to those hidden stockpiles if they agreed to work together in a unified rebellion. The other realms did their part by recruiting a force of trained mech warriors, pilots and crews that would leave behind civilized space until the time was right. Though perhaps civilized space is a misnomer given what transpired in May 2760. The Bell Accords, signed during the Age of War, was a mutual agreement between the Capellan Confederation and the Federated Suns not to use nuclear weapons against each other, no matter the conflict. Though the Ares Conventions, which contained similar restrictions, had long since been rescinded, the Bell Accords still held. This meant little to the Chesterton Liberation Battalion, a paramilitary group who were able to procure and detonate just such a device on the planet Demeter.
The history of the Chesterton dispute is one framed by absurdity. At one time, the capital of an early trading league, the Chesterton Worlds would go on to become a partner of the Tikhonov Union, a bygone rival to the Capellans and the Liao family. The ruling Tetrarchs fought a number of small wars with the neighboring Marlet Association over control of the planets. As time marched forward, those smaller nations were subsumed by the eventual successor states, passing on their ancient grudges. Since the founding of the Star League, the Capellans had argued bitterly over their claim to Chesterton, despite the reality that it was Federated Suns territory decades before the Confederation even existed.
Many would be forgiven for thinking that the so-called glory days of the League were a utopian era of human societal evolution and cooperation. This is certainly how the League would project themselves to the common citizen, But the truth was far more sobering. Hidden, petty conflicts would spark regularly, as ancient grudges simply didn't disappear because of the formation of the League. The Hidden Wars are proof of this, and one of the first major cracks of the League's so-called unity.
This came at a time when the Confederation was transitioning between rulers, the young Barbara Liao taking office only 4 days before the attack. The Fed Sons immediately placed the blame at the door of the Capellan secret police, known as the Mashkarovka. Though Barbara vociferously denied such accusations, there was always a lingering doubt on both sides as to whether director Tai Yong-guok was indeed the instigator. Regardless, First Prince John Davian took action, beginning a short and often overlooked border war between the two. It would grow to encompass a dozen worlds along 3 of the 4 combat regions within the Capellan March, but the main body of the fighting was within a 60 light-year bubble around Redfield, where the primary Davian thrust took place. The 17th Avalon Hussars relocated from Robinson to Royalston in order to train troops ahead of the upcoming attack. This would be the first outing for John Davian's March Militia initiative, involving all 4 of the Capellan March units, with the Chesterton and Royalston brigades seeing heavy combat. At the sore tip of Davian's thrust into the Confederation were the 17th and 22nd Avalon Hussars, leading the attack on Redfield, while a deep raid was launched against Way to keep the Capellans off balance. In 2761, another advance on Halloran 5 was repulsed by the Ariana Grenadiers Regiment of the Chesterton Regulars. To prevent the Federated Sons from launching a major invasion, the Chesterton Guardians Regiment of the Capellan Hussars conducted numerous raids against supply depots across the border. Chesterton itself, a point of contention going back over 400 years, would be the site of a Capellan counterattack. Their occupation of the planet was brief, ultimately driven back by the Certis Fusiliers and a population that had no desire to join the Confederation, a nation of which they had never been a part. The following year, the Avalon Hussars succeeded in capturing Redfield. This was the first planet to change hands by force of arms since the War of Davian's succession. The SLDF in the region was kept hamstrung by the High Council, who gave orders not to intervene. 37th Corps Major General Simone Folk-Smith refused to listen to the Council Lords and had to be removed from command over the incident. Kerensky, who was out in the deep wilderness of the Outlaws Alliance at the time, was too far to enforce his own will on the matter. Ultimately though, all these hostilities would be forgotten overnight following the events at the next High Council session. Richard Cameron turned 18 on February 9, 2762. For some time he had been theorising on how best to make his mark on the Star League once he came into power. He presented his idea to Kerensky, which would come to be known as Executive Order 156, a proposal that would more than halve the militaries of the member states and completely outlaw private armies. Kerensky cautioned against such an order, knowing that it would never be accepted by the council. Egged on by Amaris, however, Richard went ahead with it, only to receive a terse invite to an emergency council session later that month. When the State Lords discovered that this was not some mistake or bad joke, they gave Richard Cameron such a dressing down that he was forced to withdraw his proposal. When he turned to Kerensky for support, he received none, only Amaris speaking in his favour. After this, the Council Lords went their separate ways, and would not reconvene for almost 20 years. The emergency session of 2762 would transpire to be the last High Council meeting before disaster gripped the Inner Richard disbanded the council entirely after his rejection, and from then on ruled alone. His actions were unquestionably illegal, as outlined by the Star League Accords, and the various member and associate member states quickly took to ignoring his decrees. Unfortunately for the Star League and the Terran hegemony in particular, Cameron had precious little knowledge on how to run such a vast realm, and things quickly went sideways for him. His reputation across most of the Star League was one of a fool, but within the hegemony he was viewed as a genuine danger. In just a few short years, the economy was nosediving, and the quality of living was going down with it.
Despised in his day as a childish and petulant ruler, history has not been kind to Richard Cameron even after his death. While he may have been an unwitting architect of the Star League's downfall, it's important to remember how many of his actions were orchestrated by Amaris, the puppet master who would destroy both Richard and the noble house to which he belonged. In the end, he was just another victim of the Periphery Lord's lust for power.
Recent years had seen a change at the top step of government for several realms within the Star League. Besides Barbara Liao, In 2760, the Magistracy of Canopus saw the rise of Janina Centrella, who reversed the decisions of her predecessor that had seen it become the one realm reducing the size of its military. With the support of Colonel John Raventha III, the Duke of Fanadir, she began her own expansion. That same year in the Lyran Commonwealth, General Kerensky lost one of his firmest supporters when Archon Michael Steiner II passed away. The two had been close friends from early in Alexander's career, Michael being somewhat of a mentor to him. This had at the time put Kerensky in the bad graces of Michael's son Robert, who viewed the up-and-coming SLDF officer as a rival for his father's attention. While the relationship wasn't overtly hostile, the commanding general would see precious little support from that quarter going forwards. Lastly, in 2763, Ewan Marek died and was replaced by his son Kenyon. While a great improvement for the Free Worlds and potentially for future international relations, this was a terrible shift for Alexander. The two had first met in 2756, when the young Marek served on the commanding general's staff. Kenyon's orders had seen a protest on Pollux brutally put down, earning him a stinging rebuke from Kerensky, and a wound to his pride from which Marek had never recovered. One event that went largely unnoticed around this time was the disappearance of one of the Star League's Expeditionary Brigade's detachments. This unit's mandate was to search out new habitable planets, others with easily exploitable natural resources, and even to search for any lost pockets of humanity that travelled into the distant reaches during the early Exodus. However, in late 2763, they instead stumbled onto one of the RimWorld's supply caches and was immediately targeted for destruction by the forces in garrison. With the rest of the unit in the process of being disbanded due to the rising tensions, the SLDF missed what could have been a vital early warning. Richard Cameron, meanwhile, had his sights set on a prospective partner. Elise Graham had been one of the rare individuals in his young life that had seemed totally unintimidated by the supremely powerful First Lord, and was one of the few who told him no. In time, he became enamoured with her. Richard wasn't quite sure how to deal with this at first. He had already a reputation as a lech, but as his interest in Elise grew, those inclinations fell into the background. In early 2763, he found a solution. He proposed to Lady Graham, and remarkably, she said yes. The two were married within months. Cameron continued to fumble his way through government though. A desperate and ill-conceived attempt to redress the balance of power came when he passed the Taxation Edict of 2763, which once again saw the near-destitute periphery forced to pay substantial sums towards the SLDF so that it might maintain its advantage. Needless to say, this was extremely unpopular, and the territorial states openly refused, even the loyal RimWorld's Republic. The other member states during this time were content to sit back and let the First Lord dig himself further into a hole. In the Magistracy, the ruling Centrellas used their fortunes to begin hiring mercenaries from June 6, 2764, as they had done during the build-up to the Reunification War. Other periphery groups were privately funding the growing number of territorial state independence movements within the Inner Sphere itself. The largest of these was the Periphery Liberation Movement, who had been steadily growing in numbers over the last decade. By and large, the demonstrations put on by the PLM had remained peaceful, but in 2764, a sudden spike of 300 bombings across the Star League were attributed to them, despite their denials, and the SLDF came down hard. This in turn caused many of their members to respond with violence themselves, further escalating the situation.
Periphery states had gone out of their way for a long time to be free of suggestions like control, or hell, even taxes or tariffs. When invited to join the Star League, most of the periphery flat out said no. The Star League, being the Star League, decided to have the periphery regardless of what anyone there thought about it, as a unifying measure of strategic feel-good. Naturally, many people in the periphery didn't like this, and decided to do something about it. Terror attacks and asymmetrical warfare were only the beginning. Soon enough, they'd escalate to strategic weapons to remind people that Maslow's hierarchy of mutually assured defense is a doctrine to some people.
2764 was the final year of the pre-war crisis. The periphery was a powder keg that would take only the tiniest spark to ignite. The next year, Operation Torch would become that spark. For now though, Alexander Kerensky was stationed in the Taurian Concordat, making preparations for what he knew would be a violent conflict. It would be an understatement to say he was surprised to welcome into his camp none other than Stefan Amaris. The RimWorld's president came to him with information that he hoped would help ease relations between the two. Amaris reported that the Taurian Freedom Army, a terrorist group behind many anti-Star League attacks, was headquartered on the world Kamadier. Kerensky was both stunned and mistrusting, but his own military intelligence was soon able to verify the information. The 114th Pursuit Squadron was dispatched along with the 509th Battle Regiment and attendant mechanized infantry units. Spearheading the attack was the Special Armed Services. The raid was a tremendous success for the SLDF, and not just because they had eliminated the terror cell. Within the compounds, they found proof tying the group to some of the most senior elements within the Concordat, including Taurian Defense Force Comptroller Ernest Klein, all but proving their complicity in the attacks.
A growing problem developed within the SLDF, who saw firsthand the effects of the depredations of the Council Lords and mismanagement of the Cameron Line. History would cast Amaris and Kerensky as two of its great rivals. In all of this, there seemed to be a moment where some believe the two may have even aligned together, and this is both a fascinating and terrifying prospect to consider.
Before Amaris and Kerensky parted ways, Alexander spoke up. He declared that while thankful for the information the president had provided, he believed that Amaris was a bad influence on Richard Cameron, and cautioned him to back off. In response, Stefan declared that he was returning not to the hegemony, but home to the Rimworlds, and would not be back on Terra again for some time. But on his return voyage, he made one final stop at the court of the Star League to visit the First Lord. He reported on the seriousness of things on the front and concluded that before long, the SLDF might need to move all of its reserves to the periphery. On the 21st of July 2764, Amaris and Cameron concluded between them a secret agreement, the Humanities Homeworld Defense Act, which said that if Richard was ever in need, he could call upon the Rimworld's army for his protection. And true to his prediction, within 2 years, the RWA would outnumber the SLDF in the hegemony by more than 2 to 1.
Arms races are a funny thing, especially when there are artificially imposed or agreed upon nuances like limitations of strategic arsenals. The issue is, inevitably, someone will step the line and continue to push until all semblance of power is gone, and thus every other state must follow, a risk becoming past tense. In times of crisis, nations frequently take the road of arming rapidly as is economically feasible, or borrowing against their industrial base to make it happen all the sooner. The slow boiling rise of tensions, as always, manifests in the predictable ways in the inner sphere. Undeclared border skirmishes escalating to brush wars. It was a time of vast proliferation, and the Star League couldn't be everywhere all at once.
At the dawn of 2765, humanity was barely 3 months away from the most appalling war in its history. To help us cover the coming conflict and better understand the sheer scale of the war, this chapter is dedicated to examining the strength and deployments of the various militaries. Through the records of the day, we can paint a picture of the inner sphere as it was in the year 2765, and in so doing, explain why it was that war had become an inevitability. When the Star League was first founded in the 26th century, the reunification war that followed resulted in over 100 million deaths. 2 centuries later, the armies that were gearing up to fight were more than 5 times the size of those that had fought back then. Indeed, the Star League Defense Force was the largest military ever put together, with thousands of regiments and warships at its disposal. There is no better place to start our overview than with the colossal Star League Defense Force itself, which at the war's outset was helmed by Commanding General Alexander Kerensky. The SLDF had 2 branches, the regular army for ground operations and the navy for space combat. Aerospace assets were found in both, either operating independently or integrated into another unit. The rare blue water ships were found in the specialized Can Marine regiments within the regular army, so named for their ability to deploy with cavalry, armoured, aerospace and naval assets. The SLDF from 2575 that had seen combat during the reunification war had a little over 500 warships and around 270 regiments. By 2765, those numbers had exploded to around 2,250 warships and an incredible 4,300 regiments, around 2,000 of which were battlemech commands. Control of such a vast military was well beyond the abilities of a single man, instead falling to the Star League High Command. Kerensky and his deputy commanding general, Aaron de Chevalier, headed this group of 36 senior generals and admirals. Under them were the SLDF Chief of Staff, Tomohiro Musuibe, and the directors of the 4 operational commands, Andreas Oberquelu III of Regular Army Command on New Earth, Joan Brandt of Naval Command aboard Columbus Station orbiting Mars, Koji Telasco of Special Forces Command, and Tamerlane Stephenson of Royal Command, both based on Terra. The heads of each military region filled out the rest of the High Command, with additional input from the Logistical and Support Command directors. The organisation of the SLDF retained its multiples of 3 format, as did the militaries of all other states, but from a division level on up, this rigid structure no longer applied. At the absolute top level were the 10 army groups, one for each nation within the Star League. These were named for the ruling great house in that region, for example Army Group Cameron and Army Group Marek. Each was helmed by a senior general who were most often political appointments, as their main job was to represent the SLDF within their assigned state. The composition of the army groups were far from uniform and varied significantly in size. One step down was the army, building blocks of the larger army groups. The SLDF had a total of 20 armies, which were split unequally across the Star League. The associate members out in the periphery each had a single army assigned to keep the peace, as did the Terran hegemony. The other 5 member states had a trio of armies to keep them in line. The makeup of the armies reflected the type of conflict that they might be expected to face. Those out in the periphery and in the more provincial free worlds stressed maneuverability, whereas others had a more standard form. The smallest were found in the smallest nation, the Capellan Confederation, and fielded around 140 regiments each, whereas the largest were posted to the belligerent Trichonis Combine, some numbering as high as 325 regiments.
The soldiers of the Star League Defense Force, SLDF, are revered in modern times as knights in shining armor. But it's often forgotten that in their day, they existed to enforce the will of the First Lord on nations and populations that weren't always in favor of the Star League. One look at a deployment map from 2765 reveals that the SLDF was very much an army of occupation from the perspective of those who chafed under the control of a foreign government.
The 12 corps that had been around in Ian Cameron's day expanded into the first 11 armies, bringing much of their unit histories and commendations with them, though some of their heritage would transfer to the new units that would replace them. The Star Guard was the sole exception, which was rolled into 1st Army. In the era of Kerensky, there were 72 individual corps. Each army was allocated 3 or 4 of them, while each corps fielded between 4 and 9 divisions. The divisions themselves were the standard fighting unit for the SLDF, consisting of 3 brigades which were deployed together to wage a single battle. Divisions were classified as either battle mech or one of several types of infantry unit. Every type of division had at least 1 battle mech and 1 infantry brigade, with the third being the deciding factor on how the overall unit was classified. The equipment available to the infantry assets would determine whether it was mechanized, jump, or just grunt infantry, but this designation didn't always reflect the abilities of the individual regiments within. This format did create certain weaknesses that would soon become apparent in the coming chaos. Because the brigades were so interdependent, losing one key link in their operation could leave large chunks of their strength stranded without transport or without orders, creating cascading problems for others within the division. Therefore, while they might have been unstoppable in a pitched battle, they were vulnerable when things got ugly. Individual brigades were almost never dispatched on the offensive because of this. The SLDF was aware of this potential problem and had a solution: the independent regiments. These were most often assigned at a corps level and could, as the name suggests, operate independently on extended missions or maneuvers with their own support network and permanently assigned transport. Those armies who were geared towards flexibility, like those in the periphery, had an increased complement to these. They were most often assigned to smaller scale hotspots, or if part of a larger operation alongside a conventional division, to flank or exploit weak points in the enemy's line. Occasionally, armies would be assigned several of these units grouped together into regimental combat teams, which would either be entrusted to a corps or split between them to be recalled and regrouped if needed.
Many speak of the beginning of the reunification war as the end of peace. Do you consider that, in truth, the grand experiment that was the Star League was born out of strife, its peace paid for by the blood of billions? The collaboration and unification of the great houses under the banner of the Star League was, in part, achieved at the cost of many. From the innocents on all sides, caught in the middle by the soldiers and sailors of the various combatant factions, and by the periphery states whose only wish was to be left alone.
General Amalthea Kincaid's legacy of reformations lived on into 2765. Whereas at one point the SLDF had fought as a combined arms military even down to a battalion level, the SLDF that Kerensky led now fielded entire brigades that were exclusively one category of unit, whether infantry, armour or battle mech. This was true of regiments as well, almost without exception. One quirk of the regular army that is most unusual by today's standards is the uniformity of their war assets. Each lance was composed of 4 of the same mech, vehicle or aerospace fighter. This was commonly true of whole companies and occasionally even entire battalions. In very rare instances, a regiment could be entirely outfitted with just one type of unit, such as the 3286th Heavy Assault stationed on Taurus, which could field 108 Stalker mechs. Like the rigidity inherent in the deployment of divisions, this gave them great strength and specialization when fighting together, but left them vulnerable if a part was missing. As well as the units themselves, the SLDF relied on extensive and widespread use of fortifications across the entire Star League. These ranged from the more conventional forts up to the extremely elaborate Castles Bryan, some of which dated back almost 400 years to before even the Age of War. The Terran hegemony was bordered by a ring of these imposing emplacements known as the Home Circle. A less defined circle existed at roughly 250 light years from Terra, and a third along the border and within the periphery. Castles Bryan were designed to be almost unassailable bastions, able to withstand orbital bombardment and even nuclear strikes. Nor could they be ignored by an invader, as the many hidden entrances would allow the occupier to launch sorties into the attacker's rear areas. More than 100 of these were scattered across the hegemony, the highest concentration being the 20 installations on Earth. The best known SLDF complex is of course the Citadel. While not at Castle Bryan itself, it boasted many of the same features and served as High Command's base of operations. Located just outside Unity City, the unofficial name for the core of the Star League but often used to refer to the wider metropolitan area, the Citadel was all but impregnable. In addition to the more obvious defences, secret bases were constructed within the member and territorial states from which counterattacks could be launched should any ever try to break from the Star League, such as the Damocles contingency aimed at the Free Worlds. 2 of the more famous include the Nagayan Mountain Complex on Helm and Camelot Command within the Dark Nebula. Sadly, centuries of searching and exploration by treasure hunters have concluded that both were lost during the ensuing wars. Last, but certainly not least, the space defense systems still operated within the hegemony, though Simon Cameron had put a stop to their further development and proliferation. Of the dozen or so designs that had been trialled over the years, 4 naval vessels had entered mass production. In addition to the components in space, large emplacements built onto the surface of the planets, moons or asteroids added considerable strength to the defences. The most basic naval element was the M3 drone. All of the space that a dropship might normally have dedicated to sustaining a crew was instead housing more arms and armour. Mistaking one of these drones for a mere assault dropship could cost a vessel its life, as in truth they packed as much firepower as a small corvette. When too heavily damaged to continue fighting, these drones would plot collision courses with the enemy ships, a trait shared with their larger brethren. It's often mistakenly believed that the drones were completely autonomous, but in reality there was a small team of officers directing the operations of every SDS. Oftentimes these were located on the ground, but others controlled things from Howdah command ships. Each station could manage between a few dozen and a few hundred drones depending on the size of the computer within. The most sophisticated of these was the Advanced Tactical Analysis Computer, which could coordinate ship actions far faster than its human counterparts. Possessing the digitized strategic minds of several noteworthy admirals, they had a frightening intelligence during naval encounters. The next step up was the M5 Capital drone, more commonly known as the Casper. Equivalent in size to the Lola-class destroyer on which they were based, they were actually closer to battleships in terms of weapons load. Most every planet in the hegemony had at least a couple floating somewhere in the system, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The largest and most daunting of all was the M9 battle station, better known as the Pavese. These 2-kilometer-long juggernauts were matched in size by only the absolute top of the Star League Navy. Primarily support vessels for the other drones, a Pavese could repair and rearm any damaged SDS ship without the need for a human technical crew. They carried a complement of over 100 Voidseeker aerospace fighter drones and a weapons payload more devastating than even the top-of-the-line Mechana-class warship. All this came at a cost of virtual immobility. Its comparatively diminutive engines meant it fought without the mind-bending maneuvers of its smaller counterparts. The biggest issue facing the SLDF in 2765, other than a periphery on the brink of all-out war, was inter-service factionalism. When the Star League was first founded, one of the challenges was getting the new recruits from the many different nations to come together and put aside their past differences. Thanks to the actions of commanding generals Naruff Cameron and Lee, this had largely been accomplished by the end of the 26th century. 150 years later, the problem was the inverse. The royal units from within the Terran hegemony had always been entrusted with the first use of the most advanced technology, which over time had created a serious animosity among the rest of the SLDF. Worse, the royal command had a definite character of elitism and superiority at almost all levels. The ill will had not boiled over into violence, but there was a distinct feeling of us versus them among the divisions. The defense of the Terran hegemony military region rested with the three corps of the supremely prestigious 1st Army, the 1st, 10th, and 21st, for a total of 7 battlement divisions and 16 infantry, plus 18 independent regiments. The Terran Regimental Combat Team was also assigned to 1st Army. Adding considerable strength to this seemingly small garrison were the tens of thousands of reservists, retired soldiers and officers, and the many new recruits still in training. The baseline allocation for battlement divisions for all member states was 18, with varying amounts of infantry divisions in support depending on the size and belligerence of the individual nation. The Federated Sun's military region, for example, had 54 of these, plus 18 independent regiments for fast response, including the 4th RCT, which fittingly was assigned to the 4th Army. The Capellan Confederation military region had the fewest number of infantry divisions, at just 31. The 5th RCT was at the command of 7th Army, for a total of 13 independent regiments altogether. The Confederation was not quite as anti-Star League as some of the other nations, but was one of the most hostile towards the actual SLDF, a resentment that came from their perceived lack of support during the border war. The Free Worlds League military region had 40 infantry divisions, plus an enormous 63 independent regiments. With most of the FWLM clustered within the provinces, the independent worlds were particularly exposed to banditry and required a larger contingent of quick response troops. The Lyran Commonwealth military region fielded 44 infantry divisions and 27 independents. 12th Army was assigned the understrength 2nd RCT, which had recently taken a beating on the Taurian world of Detroit. Ambushed by a full division of rebel militia, 3 whole SLDF regiments were destroyed in a nuclear strike and ensuing battle. Only the 25th Stryker was able to escape. The Draconis Combine military region warranted by far the largest contingent of SLDF troops of any member state, chiefly because they were the sole nation involved in all 3 of the hidden wars. While tensions between them had actually quietened and weren't as overtly hostile as the Free Worlds or Capellans, or especially the Periphery, the Combine mech warriors still continued to engage in dueling which stretched that relationship. The 3 armies in this region had 7 battlement divisions each, plus another 81 infantry divisions altogether. 36 independent regiments were dispersed across the realm, including the 3rd RCT assigned to 16th Army. The 4 armies assigned to the territorial states had a standard complement of 6 battlement divisions, 15 infantry divisions, and 30 independent regiments. The only exception to this was 20th Army with 1 additional battlemech unit. 20th had begun withdrawing from the Rimworlds in 2757, but had delayed moving to their next berth in the Outworlds for almost a decade. In 2765 they were dispersed across the Corwood side of the Inner Sphere. Officially there were no RCTs deployed in the periphery, but a handful of corps had created their own ad hoc equivalents. The 46th operated their independence in 3 loose brigades, the 47th grouped 8 of their 10 regiments into teams Castor and Pollux, while the 48th fielded task forces Sagittarius, Hippocampus and Aegis. Supporting the regular army were the 20 fleets of the Star League Navy. At one time envisioned to work hand in hand with their matching army, former Commanding Admiral David Peterson was able to free them from this previously restrictive deployment, and the Navy now operated independently. Each fleet had between 3 and 5 squadrons, save First Fleet, which had 7. All this added up to a total of 1,500 warships. The first and second were dedicated command fleets, which spent most of their time either at the front or in the heart of the Star League. 5 of their squadrons were specially outfitted with McKenna-class command ships. Together, they would form the Star League Emergency Command Post, a network of warships from which the entire SLDF could be operated in the unthinkable event that the Citadel was in some way destroyed. The First Lord, Commanding General and High Command were each assigned a vessel, the SLS Star League, McKenna's Pride and Enterprise, with the 2 reserve vessels from Second Fleet, SLS CAF and New Earth, performing additional duties as required. The 3rd through 12th fleets were each responsible for naval operations in the Terran Hegemony, Draconis Combine, Federated Suns, Capellan Confederation, Free Worlds League, Lyran Commonwealth, Magistracy of Canopus, Outlaws Alliance, Taurian Concordat, and Rimwells respectively, though the latter had left alongside the regular army. The 13th through 20th fleets were operated across borders and worked to track any hostile movements back to their sources, as well as reinforcing the more established fleets where needed. In addition to the 20 battle fleets, there was also the Garrison Fleet, which alone could match half of the others combined. However, it was a fleet in name only, as the 750 warships were dispersed across the entire Star League as either singles or groups of 2. Lastly, as well as the over 2,000 active vessels, roughly another 1,000 were sitting in various states of disrepair, disassembly, or in some cases mothballed for future use. These could be brought into service if a large enough crisis emerged.
After the first dreadnoughts entered service under James McKenna, warships would become a regular sight within the navies of the Inner Sphere. The Star League, at its height, operated a staggering 2,000 vessels. Less than a quarter would survive its collapse. Today, not a single one remains. Even a handful of ships could radically shift the balance of power between nations, so identifying and preventing any efforts to construct one remains a top priority for every intelligence agency. But with the absence of any rival fleets, and the costs involved in maintaining one enormous, it's debatable as to what they could achieve that can't be done for less. It would seem that every nation has concluded that a navy is only required if your opponent has one, and an informal status quo not to construct one has been settled upon. Warships are somewhat of a Pandora's box, and the modern-day successor states seem content not to open that can of worms.
The SLDF was ultimately just one of 10 militaries within the Star League, and though its power was unequalled, no one in High Command was taking that for granted. They fully understood that any of the member states could pose a serious challenge should it come to war, and this was equally true for the forces of a hypothetical combined territorial state uprising. As it transpired, none of the militaries of the 5 major powers would play a significant role in the coming chaos. Their time to shine would come later that century. For the sake of completeness, we'll provide a brief overview of the brigades that existed in 2765. As ever, the other militaries used their own terminology and structure, and care must be taken to prevent mistaking a comparatively insignificant SLDF infantry brigade with one of the enormous battlemech brigades of the member states, some of which were compatible to an entire SLDF corps. The AFFS on paper was one of the strongest within the Star League. Behind the scenes, they had steadily been building up an enormous glut of military materiel since Richard Davian passed the Preparedness Act 30 years prior. Once the Council Edict of 2650 was revoked, all those stockpiles of tanks and mechs were quickly assigned the soldiers needed to form them into new units. The size of the AFFS exploded from just 52 regiments in 2750 to 110 regiments a mere 15 years later. However, it was an army that stood atop a very shaky foundation. Planetary militias had been completely gutted to accomplish this level of growth, leaving precious few behind to operate those units. The individual worlds could offer little if any resistance to hostile invaders, which would give the established AFFS regiments no time to respond to any incursion. A rapidly advancing opponent could cause the entire line to collapse. Defense then was the Federated Suns' weak point, their performance much better if on the offensive. The AFFS had 8 distinct brigades on its roster in 2765, plus the new March militias. At its core were the Avalon Hussars, numbering a full 26 battle mech regiments, more mechs than even an SLDF corps, let alone a division or brigade. The Robinson Chevaliers and Certis Fusiliers saw to the defence of the Draconis and Capellan marches, with 24 and 20 regiments respectively. Available armour and infantry assets could easily bring each to corps strength. Smaller regional brigades included the Arcadian Cuirassiers of Demeta, who protected the former Chesterton Trading League, and the Tancredi Loyalists, the remnants of Lord Adavian's Civil War army. The Dragon Lords had started life as a stopgap garrison force raised just prior to the Reunification War, and evolved into an experienced fighting brigade. The newly formed Seti Hussars Regiment was an experiment in combined arms, but so far hadn't distinguished itself. Between them, they could field another 12 regiments. A large part of the recent expansion was due to John Davian's March Militia initiative. The various planetary militias were invited to take part in a Martial Olympiad-esque tournament, at the end of which the winners were formed into a well-equipped and mobile defence brigade of 6 regiments for that region. The Capellan, Crucis and Draconis March militias can field 4, 10 and 6 units respectively. And lastly, the personal guard of the ruling Great House, the Davian Brigade of Guards, is one of the most elite units within the Inner Sphere. On the surface a mere 8 regiments, the reality is that each has enough permanently assigned infantry and armour brigades to count as a division, making the whole unit equivalent to a powerful SLDF corps. The CCAF is another Inner Sphere military that saw its strength more than double in the last 15 years. Rex Liao had begun the reformations that would significantly strengthen the defence of the Capellan state, but the Confederation owes his niece, Li Mingling, Duchess of Tikhonov, equal praise. Her efforts in securing Terran hegemony technology as the CEO of Earthworks Limited revitalized the aging military. The CCAF was also a highly principled army, with Malin Lorix continuing to spread and popularize the Lorix Order, which was a cross between the ideals of the Ares Conventions and the martial traits popular within the Draconis Combine. Numbering just 42 regiments in 2750, the 10 brigades of the CCAF now totaled 92 battle mech units. In addition, each of the 44 small duchies can field an average of 3 Home Guard regiments. While these units rarely contain any more than a company of mechs, together they add around 15 mech regiments to the total. Each of the 7 commonalities within the Confederation supports their own brigade. The Tikhonov Lancers field 8 regiments, the fractured Chesterton Regulars bring 6, the Capellan Chargers 4, the St. Ives Armoured Cavalry 15 but split across several subcommands. The Cyan Dragoons is the biggest with 17 regiments, and the Andurian Hussars can muster 7 more. The Sana Sabres had long since been disbanded during the Second Andurian War, and were replaced by the Liao Lancers, whose 16 regiments were dispersed across the realm. The 4 regiments of the Liao Guards protected the ancestral home and personal property of the ruling house, but the real elite of the CCAF was the Capellan Hussars Brigade, the 8 units belonging to the Hussars being some of the most storied and experienced in existence, some dating back to before the Confederation's founding 400 years earlier. The Free Worlds League military was one of the strongest of the member states, excluding the SLDF of course, numbering in 2750 at 60 battle mech regiments. Technically this was more than what the Council Edict of 2650 allowed, but they were able to circumvent this restriction through the judicious use of provincial forces. When pressed, they could confidently claim that they were outside of the FWLM's chain of command, but it didn't go unnoticed that a permanent seat within the commanding Dormouth Council was assigned for a liaison from each. By 2765 though, they had lagged behind in expanding their arsenal, bringing to bear only 35 new units. While this still left them stronger than any of their immediate neighbours, the comparative loss served to exacerbate some of the FWLM's natural weaknesses. As ever, the Free Worlds was hampered by how heavily they could rely on the provincial armies to support them in an offensive. As demonstrated by the Timothy Leary incident in the Third Hidden War, a stubborn duke or duchess could grind things to a halt. Defensively, however, the FWLM was very well equipped. 7 provincial brigades provided the bedrock of the League's military power. The Manic Guard was but a single regiment, which might at first look woefully under-equipped to defend the Commonwealth. However, since it is House Marek that commands the federal forces, the need for a large provincial force was non-existent. House Allison funds 2 units, 11 Orient Hussars regiments, and the 4 brigades of the Fusiliers of Orient, plus his personal ducal guard of the same unit. The Regular Hussars miraculously managed to survive the collapse of House Salage, and now House Cameron-Jones commands those 5 regiments. House Humphreys is very possessive of their 4 Defenders of Andurian units, whereas the Stuart Dragoons are a de facto federal brigade in all but name, as Earl David Stuart has ceded control to the Captain General's cousin, General Amelia Stuart Maddock. Last of the provincial brigades is the Orloff Grenadiers. Funded by House Orloff since before it split from the Duchy of Orient, the 5 Grenadier regiments are an experienced and proud unit. 4 federal brigades give the FWLM its main punch. The Maddock Militia is one of the largest units in the Inner Sphere, fielding 28 regiments. These should not be mistaken for planetary militia, as all are fully equipped with battlebanks. The fanatical Atrian Dragoons are the more experienced Freeworlds unit. Though half the size of the Marek Militia, their experience and zeal makes them more than a match for their comparatively green compatriots. The Boland Defenders hold a weird distinction of being a provincial force without a province, as all 11 regiments occupy the Boland salient jutting into the Lyran Commonwealth. Lastly, the 6 regiments of the Freeworlds Guard are the elite and personal command of the Captain General. The Lyran Commonwealth now holds the dubious distinction of being the weakest of the member states, a situation which seems in conflict with their enormous industrial output. In 2750 they had 52 battlemech regiments at their disposal, but have only expanded to 92 in the years since. A large part of this is due to Operation Catalogue, a venture which, in the process of tracking and eliminating a large criminal underworld, discovered widespread corruption within their own ranks. Several units were dissolved and many more had their officers replaced. Still, the LCAF, despite its bumbling reputation, is a military that can bring considerable power to bear. Its 9 brigades are some of the largest within the Inner Sphere. Like the Freeworlds, it has its own provincial forces, the Donegal Guards and Sky Rangers, fielding 11 and 16 regiments respectively. The Tamar Marines no longer existed as a unit, and the Tamar Pact took instead to supporting the 17 Arcturan Guards regiments, which were once the federal troops for the whole Commonwealth. That role has since been subsumed by the Lyran Guards Brigade. This colossal unit is divided into 5 divisions of between 4 to 10 regiments apiece, though they do not fight in concert as do the SLDF divisions. Altogether, there are 31 regiments, making it the largest battlemech brigade in the Inner Sphere. The Lyran Regulars is a semi-permanent retirement and garrison unit within the LCAF, which currently musters 5 regiments. A trio of small brigades funded by the local planetary governments or nobility include the Odessa and York Regulars, fielding 2 and 3 regiments respectively, and 3 more from the Hesperus Guards, 2 of which are the last link to the former Tamar Marines. On a related note, while outside of the LCAF and not counted among their roles, the Tamar Tigers is the personal bodyguard regiment of the Kelswars and is frequently loaned to House Steiner. Guarding the Archon himself are 4 Royal Guards regiments, the elite of the Lyran Commonwealth. Last up is the most serious contender to the SLDF, the Draconis Combine Mustered Soldiery. At a surface level, the 115 battlemech regiments, up from 55 in 2750, pales in comparison to the approximate 2,000 battlemech regiments within the SLDF. This overlooks 2 vital details though. The first is how many of those can actually be deployed within the Combine when they're needed to garrison the rest of the Star League. The second is how vast the conventional forces fielded by the Dragon have become. What once were regiments are now the battlemech spear point of a full combined arms brigade. The 4 military districts each field a division of regulars, though it'll soon become clear how inadequate the word division is. The Benjamin Regulars, led by warlord Ayaki Fujiwara, inhabit a crucial nexus within the Inner Sphere, but have the strength, flexibility and experience to deal with this assignment. Their 19 brigades have a combined strength of 190 regiments all told, more than some SLDF armies, and that's just the beginning. The Pesht Regulars don't have quite the same prestige, but their 8 brigades muster 72 regiments. The Razelhag Regulars are under constant suspicion within the DCMS on account of their rocky history, but still field 26 brigades or 234 regiments. The Galadin Regulars are even larger and are the best equipped of the 4. 29 brigades add up to 348 regiments in total, larger than even the mighty SLDF 14th Army, which comes in at 325. Quantity is only one half of the equation, however. Elitism within the DCMS on the part of the battlemech officers was systemic, and most either used their armour and infantry regiments as disposable cannon fodder or left them sitting in the rear while they strode forward to claim the glory. That reason more than any other gave the SLDF a fighting chance if war were to break out between the two. 5 smaller commands completed the DCMS roles. The Dayron Regulars were conceived as a threat to the Terran hegemony that the Combine would reclaim the worlds lost to them during McKenna's campaigns of persuasion in the early 24th century. 5 brigades or 39 regiments. The 5 brigades of the Arcab Legion hailed from that same region of space, totaling 35 regiments. The Proserpina Hussars were one of the more elite units better trained with combined arms, fielding 6 slightly smaller brigades of 5 regiments apiece, 30 in total. One of 2 units not equipped with permanent armour and infantry complements were the Sunzang Kader, providing the fanatical recruits from that selfsame military academy 11 regiments with which to get their first frontline experience. This was no easy duty and was very much a sink or swim environment. But the elite of the elite were the 5 reinforced regiments of the Sword of Light Brigade. In total, the number of frontline regiments fielded by the DCMS in 2765 was around 1,000, with a few hundred more conventional forces spread among the realm and garrison. Projections showed that by the end of the decade, they were on course to raise another 5 to 10 brigades. The member states also made limited use of mercenaries during this time, euphemistically referring to them as independent battlemech specialists or defense contractors. The biggest employers of these were the Draconis Combine and Capellan Confederation, who each claimed around 8 to 10 regiments worth, though no single unit was regimental in size. These were some of the favourite forces to use in the border raids that were ubiquitous across the realm. The other nations were little better, as each had contracted at least 1 regiment's worth. Over the last 150 years, most of the Ionosphere navies had been either mothballed, scrapped, or sold off. Many pilots were now operating ancient hulks that were no threat in a stand-up fight to modern warships, but could prey upon the undefended merchant vessels. Comparing what little was left to the mighty Star League Navy is a sad affair. Any single SLN fleet outnumbered the entire navy of the member states. What those nations refer to as fleets are smaller than Star League squadrons. The Federated Suns Navy is split into 4 fleets. The Rimwood, Corewood and Spinwood fleets cover the Capellan, Draconis and Periphery borders respectively, while the Crucis fleet moves within the realm to wherever they're best needed. The Capellan Navy was the weakest, with its 5 wealthiest commonalities each operating a fleet, while a reserve fleet contains the bulk of their strongest warships, and moves to assist in the case of a major naval engagement. As is the case with their ground forces, the Free Worlds League Navy only accounts for their federal warships. There are 5 fleets, one for each of their many borders. 5th Fleet guards against uncharted space in theory, but in practice would be the first to arrive as reinforcements when one of the others is attacked. Additionally, Orient fields 2 small squadrons, Regulus another, and Andurian a 4th. The Lyran Commonwealth is the only realm honest enough to call it how it is, and is dispersed with the fleet title. Ironically, it is the strongest of the 5. Each province has 2 squadrons, plus another trio of vessels at each provincial capital. The rest remain in reserve. Lastly, the Draconis Combined Admiralty operates 2 small fleets in each of its military districts, and has 2 more warships permanently assigned to the 1st Proserpina Hussars. SLDF High Command knew that they would soon be squaring off against the Periphery in what would likely be a major uprising. While the political unrest was causing them no end of problems, they thought at least that they would be on top of things should the situation transition into war. None of the former independent states of the Periphery were at their pre-reunification war levels. Between them, they had just 44 battlemech and 56 conventional regiments. The SLDF was lacking one crucial piece of information though, the existence of the so-called Secret Army out in the deep Periphery.
The Secret Army of the Rimworld's Republic is one of the black eyes that the League would never historically heal from. How the League's intelligence agencies missed this is still something of a mystery. You could say that they had become lazy, maybe even arrogant in their position, but the failure here by the League would be felt not just by the soldiers who would end up fighting this secret army, but also the civilians who would suffer greatly by their hand.
Janina Centrella had spent the last 5 years reversing the actions of her predecessor and gradually building up the MAF. 9 regiments had survived the reunification war, though in truth, so many battlefield losses meant it was effectively closer to 3. Some, such as the Canopian Grenadiers, had been disbanded as recently as 2748. Since then, they had publicly expanded to 15 regiments, split between 4 brigades. The Magistracy Royal Guards were responsible for the protection of Centrella herself, and the estates of her family. The Chasseurs à Cheval had reformed 3 of their Canopian light horse regiments, and continued to be amongst the most experienced cavalry units within the Star League. The Canopian Fusiliers had expanded to 4 regiments and were better suited to a stand-up fight. Lastly, there were 6 People's Volunteers units, whose primary purpose was planetary garrison. To further support the MAF, Centrella had hired around 12 regiments worth of mercenaries, though no single unit was regimental in size. The Outworlds Alliance had begun the reunification war with only a single loosely organised mech regiment, but largely through the actions of Colonel Elias Pitcairn had expanded to 5 by war's end. They had maintained those numbers since then, and like everyone had begun expanding in 2752, now possessing a respectable 11 regiments. The Avalar Guard's duty was to protect the Avalar line, and had some of the most fanatical mech warriors within the Alliance military corps. The cream of the crop were the Alliance Borderers, led by Chairman Omprakash Chern, and could always be found at the front in any major engagement. 3 regional units, the Blomstein Demons, Cerberus Watch, and Omferwacht Guards, would frequently be in support. 3 militia brigades fielded a pair of mech regiments each, and took care of local defence. They were the Remora Regulars, Balagora Fusiliers, and Trader Sentinels. The Taurian Defence Force had suffered the worst casualties during the reunification war. At their peak, they had maintained 8 small corps, plus the Taurian Guard Corps and more than a dozen volunteer guard regiments. Of the almost 38 battlement regiments that had begun the fight in 2578, only 13 had lasted the duration. The Star League had ensured those numbers hadn't risen even by 2750, but just as had the other periphery realms, they too expanded to 18 mech regiments. They, along with the supporting conventional forces, were split across 4 corps plus the Taurian Guard. The Brinton Defenders were assigned to 1st Corps, the Hades Light Infantry, Guards and Cavalry filled out 2nd Corps, 3rd Corps had both the surviving Pleiades Hussars, Pleiades Lancers and Perdition Guards, 4th Corps the 4 Damasus Legionnaire regiments, and the consolidated Taurian Guard formed the foundation of their new corps alongside the Concordat Commandos and Taurian Velites. The Taurian Special Asteroid Support Force was an offshoot of the unique Hades Special Services that had fought among the interstellar bodies of Flanagan's Nebula during the closing days of the war. Commanded by Space Master Fern Hagley, they were a specialised element attached to the Taurian Guard Corps. Of the 138 warships that had fought for the ISB in the reunification war, just 11 had survived to the end, 2 for the Canopians and 9 Taurian vessels. By 2750, those had slightly expanded to 9 and 15 respectively, and the Outworlds Alliance had acquired its very first warships. The navies of the periphery states in 2765 were almost exclusively composed of small Pinto-class corvettes. The Canopian fleet had 20 of them, as well as the Concordat-class MCS Fury and Admiral Justin Marcus Cleave's Athena-class flagship MCS Cassandra Centrella. The Outworlds operates a small fleet of 15 Pintos, led by Chairman Arthur Engelman aboard OAS Pulsar. The Concord Navy is a shadow of its former self. Alongside its 18 Pintos, there is a Dart light cruiser, a Vincent corvette, the last remaining Wagon Wheel class frigate, the TCS Merope, 6 Concordat frigates, and 4 Lola-class destroyers. The 94-year-old Marshal Amberlyn Dyness commands the 31 warships of the Concord Navy from aboard TCS Pleiades. These were the forces the Star League feared they would soon be facing, yet in reality they were less than 20% of what was available. In the deep periphery, the Secret Army had expanded to a terrifying 279 battlemech regiments, supported by a further 171 regiments of conventional forces. These divisions were split between the Magistry of Canopus, who received an additional 93 battlemech regiments, the Outworlds Alliance, who got 89 new mech units, and the Taurian Concordat, which took the largest portion at 97 mech regiments.
The Secret Army required a level of commitment that only the fiercely independent periphery denizens could have met. Most considered themselves true patriots and were vehemently anti-Star League. They would have to leave behind their old lives and families and depart for training camps in the deep periphery where they eked out a meager existence, waiting for the call to return.
Even the private fortunes of one of the great houses like the Amaris family wasn't enough to finance such an expansion, so where had the funding come from? Stefan had won a considerable number of development funds from the Star League itself, aimed at industrializing and expanding the territorial states. His realm had grown in size considerably over the last 2 centuries to be a near rival of any of the member states. Many of the new colonists had come from the Terran hegemony, strengthening the bond between the two nations. But Amaris routinely misappropriated these cash injections, pumping them into his covert arms acquisitions. Furthermore, a significant percentage of the funding actually came from a slew of new business connections the Rimworld's president had made within the Terran hegemony. Without explaining its purpose, Amaris had borrowed great sums from several Inner corporations who were eager to partner with a realm that was on the up and up, seeking to reclaim those loan payments tenfold in future trade deals.
Amaris had made himself a regular at court by befriending the young First Lord. As his influence grew, many powerful individuals from within the hegemony found it prudent to align themselves with the only man who seemed to have Cameron's ear. Over time, these business relationships strengthened ties between the Rimworlds and Terra. Even the common citizens saw them as brethren, unlike the other periphery realms. By 2765, Amaris had firmly ingratiated himself within the League's nobility.
At the head of this informal alliance was the powerful businesswoman and fashionista Aisling Connor. Though their association was in its early days, Aisling would in time become another of Stefan's inner circle elite. While most of the funding and materiel had come from Amaris, the army itself was staffed almost exclusively by natives of the other periphery realms. Most remained unaware of the source of their new equipment. On that note, the vast majority of the mechs and armour within the force were relics of the Age of War, and were well below the standard of the late Star League. Furthermore, the army had no proper training or cohesion, nor a supply chain to keep them operational, despite the raw numbers suggesting they could topple any of the member states save the hegemony. In truth, they were closer to a very heavily armed mob, and their performance suffered duly. Last but not least of the Star League militaries was the Rimworld's army. The RWA was a relative unknown to the SLDF, but what they did know gave them serious concerns. While Stefan Amaris appeared loyal, there was no assurance that his descendants would be equally pro-Star League, especially if the expected periphery uprising went poorly. After the Draconis Combine, the Rimworlds appeared to be the next most likely to start a war, with which of its 3 neighbours, though, remained unknown. The RWA ended the reunification war with just 2 combined arms regiments, the Amaris Republican Guard and the 4th Amaris Dragoons. The 1st Amaris Armoured had also escaped destruction during Operation Mailed Fist by dividing themselves among the many planetary militias and refusing to fight, thereby going unnoticed. A quartet of warships, 3 of which had been stuck in dry dock throughout the 20-year war, had survived as well. As previously covered, they steadily expanded up to a combined 40 regiments by 2752, but with the lifting of Directive 30, those numbers shot up over the next decade.
The Rimworld's army demonstrated a level of professionalism and loyalty that would rival any of its contemporaries or our modern equivalents. The Amaris family had spent centuries building up their military schools, such as the Apollo Military Academy and Finnmark Air and Space Academy, to match any from within the Inner Sphere. These troops were then equipped with the best machines the Rimworlds could manufacture, or Amaris could swindle from the Terran hegemony. It's no wonder that post-war, the member states did what they could to recruit them for themselves.
While Amaris' secret army was largely stocked with hand-me-downs and cast-offs, the RWA was very well equipped, with some of the elite units fielding designs otherwise exclusive to the SLDF Royal regiments. The Star League Intelligence Corps suspected these were acquired through his close friendship with Richard Cameron, but the truth was that Stefan had become such a staple within the Terran hegemony that he had forged many close alliances with other powerful individuals within the realm. They looked to him as an intermediary for dealing with the unreasonable First Lord. The Rimworld's army had a fanatical loyalty on par with even the Draconis Combine. Many were inspired by the propaganda machine and heroic individuals from the Third Hidden War, such as Colonel Zat Darg of the 4th Amaris Dragoons, who now taught at the Apollo Military Academy. Commandant of that institution was General Jasmine Amaris, the former head of the RWA, and she used this position to ensure the loyalty of her future officers. This was the public reason for their strong patriotism, but there was a more insidious reason behind the scenes. Colloquially known as the Terra, the Rimworlds had a number of institutions working in unison to assure loyalty. The first was the political officers scattered throughout the regimental command staff of the RWA. They ensured that no one within the army ever acted in a manner that was against the best interests of the Amaris family. Their civilian counterparts were the Krypteia, a secret society who kept watch over the actions of everyday Rimworlders and reported any non-conformity up the chain of command. Those individuals in question might later receive a polite word or disappear altogether. The Amaris Republican Guard that at one time had fought alongside the Star League in the Reunification War now formed the first of 26 mech regiments within the new Republican Guard Brigade. These were partnered with 28 mechanized infantry regiments and together formed into 6 divisions. This near SLDF organisational structure was used across the RWA. The Amaris Regulars were the largest brigade, an amalgamation of the Fusiliers and Armoured. They now fielded 8 divisions, mostly concentrated around Apollo. The Amaris Lancers were the more provincial equivalents and had 6 divisions of their own. Between them, they counted another 56 battle mech and 70 mechanized infantry regiments. The Imperial divisions were the elite of the RWA. Named for military heroes of the Republic's history, they counted among their ranks the most fanatical, piloting the most advanced mechs. The Stefan Amaris division was located on Apollo, Catherine Dormax on Finnmark, Hector Rowe on Timbuktu, and Taddeo Amaris on Erdvin. Each division had 4 brigades total, 2 battle mech, 1 infantry, and 1 armour. The Rimworlds was also the largest employer of mercenaries by an order of magnitude. In 2765, they had approximately 8 whole divisions worth, though mostly in small groups, few of which had the ability to fight in larger formations. Granted unofficial control of this loose assortment of units, and commander of his own mercenary regiment, was General Antilos Legos. Legos was the polar opposite of Patrick Scoffins, callous, not principled, but pragmatic, not fanatic. Much to General Scoffins' annoyance, he was also one of Amaris' inner circle, trusted with the jobs the Honourable RWA commander might object to. In total, excluding the ragtag mercenaries, the RWA fielded 95 battle mech and 115 mechanized infantry regiments, positioning themselves as by far the strongest power in the periphery. That strength carried over into their navy. By 2750 they had operated a small fleet of 18 warships, but Salanta Amaris' foresight a century prior proved fortuitous once the restrictions were removed, and they brought back into service the 30 mothballed Pintos, and continued to grow over the next decade into the largest fleet outside the SLDF. By 2765 they now operated 52 of those vessels, 32 Bonaventure and 30 Vigilant corvettes, an advanced tracker surveillance warship, 65 Riga frigates, 40 Essex, 21 Lola and 18 Carson destroyers, 7 Dart light cruisers, and 7 Monsoon battleships. Most of these vessels were sourced from none other than the SLDF reserve fleet. In this time of crisis, Amaris had convinced the First Lord to hand over the more serviceable vessels, promising to foot the bill in terms of operating cost, something which Richard did gladly. All of these totaled a dizzying 273 warships within the RWA, but even this wasn't the end of it. At the head of this vast armada was the crown jewel of the Rimworld's navy, a trio of brand new Stefan Amaris class battleships. Commanding the flagship of the same name and the RWN at large was Admiral Geoffrey Coultier. Amaris had recently acquired rights to fit these craft with the advanced lithium fusion batteries that would allow them to jump twice before recharging, and to complete that work, they, along with the rest of the Rimworld's navy, were on their way to Earth. As dawn was breaking over Fort Simpson on the planet Perdition, the mech warriors of the 265th Heavy Assault Regiment, an independent unit from 46th Corps, were beginning their daily operations. The capture of the Taurian Freedom Army base on Camadier the previous year had failed to result in the reduction in attacks and riots that the SLDF had been hoping for, suggesting there was more at work than the efforts of a simple terror cell. Tensions within the Taurian Concordat were high, but such an experienced unit, and one so heavily armed possessing nothing lighter than 60 tons, had little to fear. The date was April 14th, 2765, and at 1703 a sentry spotted a civilian vehicle approaching the base. The patrolling lance moved to investigate as the car pulled into the fort. The tarp covering the truck bed blew open at the corner, giving the mech warriors a fraction of a second to recognize the nuclear device contained within, before detonation instantaneously erased them and the rest of their unit from existence. As news of the attack spread, the citizens of the Taurian Concordat took to the streets to celebrate the defiant act of self-sacrifice made in the name of freedom from their Star League oppressor. 2 days later, the announcement the SLDF had been dreading came. Predicted by Admiral Noramboli some 32 years earlier, on April 16th, New Vandenberg and 17 other Concordat planets seceded from the Star League. Recently arrived on New Vandenberg to assist the Asta Division was the 1st French Regiment, one of the most storied units within the SLDF, dating all the way back to pre-spaceflight Terra. They were acting as an honor guard for Commanding General Kerensky himself, who had come to the infamous world in a last-ditch attempt to avoid carnage between the two factions. Unbeknownst to the SLDF and the Taurian militia, also present on the world embedded within the latter, were a pair of individuals who had a secret mandate, Operation Torch. The spark that ignited the Periphery Uprising was the Fort Gorky incident. On April 16th, an unfortunate Star League patrol broke down outside the Taurian base, and before anyone understood what was going on, the two infiltrators had opened fire, killing the infantrymen. This was the point of no return, as was fully understood by the 1st French's commander, Lieutenant General Dominique Pétain, who in a desperate last attempt to avoid the war had her entire unit go into lockdown and not retaliate. Sadly, the militia regiment mistook her actions as waiting for overwhelming reinforcements, and so launched what they believed was their only chance at survival, an all-out attack on the SLDF. All across New Vandenberg, irregular forces and the rest of the planetary militia took up arms against the Star League and attacked their positions. Kerensky himself came perilously close to losing his life, but was able to escape from the immediate ambush. From there, he headed to the location of the 7734th Battle Regiment. Within the Star Vikings base was one of the state-of-the-art Atlas II battle mechs, which Kerensky himself made full use of to hold off the attacks until rescue came. Operation Torch, the work of Rimworld Republican insurgents, had been a success, and the fire that started on New Vandenberg became self-sustaining, spreading across first the Taurian Concordat and then both the Magistracy and Outworlds. To the Star League, this period was known as the Periphery Uprising, but in the territorial states they called it the Freedom War, for that was what they were fighting for. On April 18th, news of the Fort Gorky attacks reached Alpheratz, and the 74-year-old President Beatrice Avila. Upon hearing the news, she relaxed back into her bed, drew her final breath, and spoke her last words. And so it begins. She died with a smile on her face.
The Periphery is usually the butt of some wry joke told at fancy parties or dismissed as a minor annoyance by the lords of the great houses who share a border with them. With the wounds though of the reunification war still fresh in the collective memory of these smaller states, those of the Taurian Concordat, the Magistracy of Canopus, the Outworlds Alliance, the fires of rebellion would start to burn bright, and it wouldn't take much to start a blaze that would engulf the entirety of the Periphery and bleed the forces of the League dry of men and materiel.
Many historians have debated the causes and the outcome of the reunification war, what led up to it, how it was pursued, and the aftermath. Among these debates were the many failures by various intelligence services of the SLDF, Star League, and various houses. Questions that were never answered. How did the massive buildup of the Rimworld's Republic go unnoticed? Was it hubris or incompetence that led to the Innersphere's powers to woefully underestimate the determination of the Periphery to fight to the bloody end even when they knew they were vastly outnumbered?
SLDF forces were under rebel assault all across the Periphery. They received orders to withdraw to their bases and fortify while they waited for assistance to arrive from the Inner Sphere. This conflict had been anticipated for some time, and there were numerous contingency plans to account for it. 10th Army was the first to mobilise, and the first independent regiments were set to arrive in the Magistracy of Canopus in early May. The secessionist planets, of which there were already many more than the initial 18, had withdrawn from the Star League, but not their respective territorial states. The Periphery governments were public in declaring this an internal matter and warned the SLDF to stay out of it. One particularly violent incident happened above Taurus itself. The flagship of the SLN's 111th Line Squadron, the Texas-class SLS Nebraska, had been stationed in orbit for some years as a constant reminder to the Concordat of the Starleague's reach. On a routine supply lift, a vessel packed with explosives was smuggled aboard the dropships bound for the Nebraska. As soon as it transferred across, it detonated, obliterating the ship from within. One of the broken fragments would collide with the nearby SLS Cairo, causing significant damage. This proved a rallying cry to periphery denizens everywhere, and more flocked to the cause. At this hour, the MAF, AMC and TDF remained apart from the fighting, save only local garrisons going against orders. The majority of the attacks were coming from irregular forces and occasionally the planetary militia. There was somewhere between 100 and 130 regiments of these irregulars, though the use of the term regiment implies a degree of organisation that wasn't present. Most were small bands operating on their own, some were tantamount to mere mobs. The periphery governments, while officially remaining neutral, had figuratively thrown open the doors to their armories, meaning almost everyone now carried some form of weapon. Additionally, it was estimated that around 40 regiments of the periphery militaries were engaged in the fighting, acting without orders but with tacit approval. The SLDF armies still outnumbered them significantly, with 21 divisions and 30 independents apiece, save our 19th Army who had lost a regiment in the Fort Simpson blast. Unfortunately, the SLDF's morale problems peaked in the early days of the uprising, and the units dissatisfied with the overbearing Starleague exploitation of the periphery decided that they'd had enough. Dozens of units deserted and refused to fight. Worse, almost 30 regiments took this opportunity to go rogue and join with the periphery rebels fighting for independence. For the average regular army grunt, the first sign that something more serious was going on was when they stopped receiving orders from their corps commanders, then division and brigade commanders. All across the three fronts, targeted strikes were being made against the headquarters units of each of the SLDF armies deployed within the periphery. These headhunter units were the first elements of the secret army to arrive from deep space, and were some of the few equipped with modern technology. They had only modest success, but even when they failed to assassinate the generals, they regularly succeeded in disrupting communications between the command staff and their frontline troops. Operation Guillotine, as these strikes were known, was the second phase of the Rimworld's master plan that began in 2765 and heralded a major escalation in the Freedom War. Beginning on May 9th, the seemingly endless hordes of the secret army began pouring in from all angles and caught the regular army flat-footed. Isolated in their forts spread out across the territorial states and left without orders, the SLDF was gradually overwhelmed and overrun. Numerically, the two sides were roughly equal, but with the Starleague forces spread across various garrisons and unable to issue orders to consolidate a front line, the rebels were able to achieve massive local superiority, and even with their substandard training, win crushing victories. These in turn inspired more planets to throw in their lot with the rebels, and by June, 80% of the periphery had seceded from the Starleague. Within the first weeks of their arrival, 18 of the isolated divisions had been wiped out. Many were destroyed by nuclear fire, the rebels not bothering to launch a traditional assault against their fortified bases. In July, word reached the SLDF of another battle on the far side of the Starleague. The Rimworld's planet of Gotha Damarung had come under attack from a division of rebel forces, but were beaten back by the RWA, who were able to respond with 20 combined arms regiments. This was taken as proof that the Rimworlds were not taking part in the uprising and were remaining loyal to the League. Some raised questions as to why the Secret Army had only a tenth of the manpower seen in the other realms, or why they had attacked such a heavily defended world that would see them outnumbered 2-1, but given that the Republic had a history of rejecting and violently suppressing the periphery freedom movement, and that the Secret Army had already demonstrated a lack of leadership, it was perhaps not that surprising. Of course, what we know now is that Amaris himself was behind the Secret Army, and so was never at risk. But why commit any forces at all? The truth was that he didn't. The entire Gotha Damarung affair was a staged event orchestrated by Samir Njari, the Rimworld's Minister of Communications. All of the reports and footage that came from the battle were fabrications meant to fool the Starleague into thinking they were on the same side, a task that they ultimately succeeded at. Samir was not just the CEO of Apollo-based Njari Communications and minister within the Rimworld's government, he was also a childhood friend of Stefan Amaris. That connection made his final role all the more significant. He was one of the governing council within the Cryptia. Njari had been instrumental in crafting the president's public image, which had won him such support within his own realm and among the Terran elite. Of the 5 highest members within Amaris' inner circle, he was the one closest to Stefan. By the summer of 2765, the tide was starting to turn in the periphery. The Secret Army had lost the element of surprise, and though casualties were significant, more reinforcements were arriving from the Inner Sphere. To orchestrate these new deployments in hostile realms where the established command and headquarters units were already knocked out, new army groups were established for each front. The old Centrella, Avalar and Calderon commands were disbanded, whereas Army Group Amaris remained as a headquarters unit only for the moment. 11th Army Group consisted of the 3rd, 4th, 6th and 7th. 10th Army was joined by the 9th, 12th and 13th and became the 12th Army Group, and the 13th Army Group was assigned the 15th, 16th and the free-floating 20th. As they reached the besieged units from the 17th, 18th and 19th, their commands would be gradually rolled into the new army groups. Naval support came in the form of the 5th through 19th fleets, who were all deployed to one of the 3 rebellious territorial states, while 20th was held in reserve. This radically shifted the balance of power within the periphery in favour of the SLDF. However, those units left within the Inner Sphere now needed to pull triple duty in order to continue to garrison the member states, several of which were suspected of moving towards a break from the Star League themselves, even before the uprising. To assist them, 2 of the 3 corps of 1st Army left the Terran hegemony and moved further out. This left only 1st Corps with the responsibility of guarding the core worlds, a meager 36 mech and 43 conventional regiments to defend the most important planets within the Star League. None of this happened overnight, of course. It was a gradual redeployment over the course of a year or so, but by the time the 14 armies had assembled, 304 divisions and 205 independents were fighting, equating to around 1,400 battlemech and 1,600 conventional regiments. Or to put it another way, around 70% of the entire SLDF. The Outworlds Alliance would prove one of the more challenging campaigns, as in terms of territory, it was the largest of the 3 rebellious periphery realms. On the surface, it looks as if it was the campaign to which the smallest assignment of SLDF had been dispatched, but the expansive nature of those armies that had been deployed in the Draconis Combine actually meant they had the greatest number of units available. 15th Army would push along the coreward edge of the Alliance, 20th would move along the Federated Suns border, while 16th would push up through the middle. Leadership in the Outworlds after Beatrice Avalar's death had passed to her daughter Alice, whose primary concern was staying out of the fight altogether. This didn't sit well with several within her government, and soon her brother Simpson was being talked about as a potential rival. Using his influence, he was able to get the Cerberus Watch and Remora regulars to engage the encroaching SLDF. Though reasonably experienced and equipped by AMC standards, they were outmatched, overrun and destroyed. Soon, the 16th Army and a detachment from the 20th were advancing on the capital Alpharats, finally achieving what General Amos Forlow had set out to do almost 2 centuries earlier. This brought them into contention with the veterans of the Avalar Guards and Chairman Jern's Alliance borderers. Despite a determined defence from them and the many divisions of the Secret Army, they were eventually overwhelmed. The Alliance capital fell in December 2765.
Just as the Rimworlds had fought a civil war concurrently within the reunification conflict, the Outworlds Alliance experienced their own internal power struggle during the uprising. Alice Avalar never seemed to grasp that her people were prepared to fight and die for their freedom, something which drove many into her brother's camp. In 2772, he launched a coup against his sister. Despite initial success, Alice's non-combatant position was now looked upon favorably after the dramatic shifts in power that followed the periphery uprising. An eventual compromise was reached, and the presidency was handed to her son David.
Commanding 12th Army was Admiral Joan Brandt, the former Director of Naval Command, resigning her role to take active leadership of all 1,020 warships deployed across the periphery. Her orders were for the 12th and 13th Armies to occupy the worlds immediately to Canopus's flanks and act as a staging post for the 9th and 10th Armies to push deeper into the Magistracy. The MAF officially remained apart from the conflict, but isolated strikes from the Chasseurs à Cheval were common. Their counterparts in the Fusiliers maintained more distance, however, and wisely avoided further conflict, unlike the 2nd Canopian Cuirassiers, who were destroyed. The rebels received more unofficial support from the Magistracy in the form of 12 mercenary regiments hired on by House Centrella within the last year. These were used to harass and raid Star League supply depots and slow the pace of their advance. This was a similar strategy to the one they had employed during the Reunification War.
Mercenaries in 3025 are a ubiquitous part of modern warfare, but it wasn't always this way. It was the formation of the Star League and the mandatory drawdown of member state militaries that first led to the creation of many of these mercenary bands, the use of which increased dramatically during the Third Hidden War. But it was the fall of the League that they truly established themselves as an essential part of a nation's forces, with close to 100 regiments fighting in the final decades of the Star League.
Alexander Kerensky took personal command of the Taurian theatre himself. He was supported in this task by Deputy Commanding General and longtime trusted friend Aaron de Chevalier. To the spinward end of the Concordat, he tasked those armies recently arrived from the Federated Sons, who began their assaults in the Damascus and Perdition unions. Their ultimate goal was to regroup on Serenity, thereby isolating a large chunk of the territorial state. This brought them into conflict with the Perdition Guards of 3rd Corps and the Damascus Legionnaires of 4th Corps, though few units within those organisations were SLDF standard. 6th Army moved into the far anti-spinward edge of the realm, the Brinton Union, and ran afoul of the TDF 1st Corps, the Brinton Defenders. Like their compatriots on the other end of the Concordat, these were only moderately experienced and equipped troops. Moving down the centre was 7th Army, who first targeted Atreus Prime within the Hades Union. They had the most challenging task and would face the stiffest opposition from 2nd Corps, primarily the Hades Cavalry and Guards. Kerensky knew by this point that Protector Nicoletta Calderon had been funding and arming the Taurian rebels for years, but to confront her with these accusations would almost certainly result in open war with the Concordat. As it was now, the Taurian government was trying to keep up the pretense that those TDF units engaged in the fighting were doing so out of misplaced patriotism and were acting without orders. Ultimately, calling Calderon on her duplicity wouldn't change a thing for those she had already given approval to, and would simply make the SLDF's task all the more difficult. Kerensky soon found that many of his corps and division commanders were simply not up to the task ahead of them. They were peacetime generals, and their lack of aggression was resulting in high casualties and slow progress. Many were replaced during 2765 and 66. Even at the top step, Admiral Harman Kumar retired after the Sixth Fleet's near destruction at New Ganymede and was replaced by Ilse Juan Sanchez, and 3rd Army's General Cornel Stanger was forced to step down due to health concerns. His replacement, Jack Lucas, had only just made colonel at the uprising's outset, but his ruthlessness and efficiency jumped him ahead of the pack of 1- and 2-star generals above him, becoming somewhat of a protege to General de Chevalier himself. By the end of 2765, 98 divisions had been involved in the Periphery conflict. Around 2/3 of those belonged to the 3 armies that had been garrisoned there at the start of the year, of which there was now very little remaining. Approximately half of those 98 divisions had either been destroyed or were rendered combat ineffective. 17th through 19th had suffered somewhere in the region of 75% casualties, an appalling loss for the SLDF. New recruits were barely keeping those units afloat. However, with the bulk of 10 further armies still streaming over the borders, the territorial states were finding things increasingly stacked against them. In 2766, new troubles were developing within the Star League. The Periphery Liberation Movement began a second wave of bombings within the Heartlands, targeting over 100 planets, 80 of which were within the Terran hegemony itself. This was the last straw for the First Lord Richard Cameron, who decided that the time had come to invoke the Humanities Homeworld Defense Act. Word went out to Stefan Amaris that help was needed. The RWA responded immediately. Beginning in the mid-year, Republican troops started to arrive on Earth. The honour guard for this new wave of reinforcements was the elite 4th Amaris Dragoons, led by Colonel Zat Dag. This unit was attached to Cameron's own personal bodyguard, the pinnacle of the entire SLDF, the Royal Black Watch.
The lead unit, not just within the Stefan Amaris Imperial Division, but the entire Rimworld's army, was the 4th Amaris Dragoons. When the RWA split in two during the Reunification War, they remained loyal to the first consul. They later fought alongside the SLDF during the final liberation of Apollo and became a de facto house unit of the Amaris family. Their loyalty was rewarded with the best equipment the Rimworlds could acquire.
When the 4th Amaris Dragoons deployed to Terra, they were partnered with Richard Cameron's own Royal Black Watch, the personal bodyguard of the First Lord. That Amaris would send his best troops to bolster Richard's defenses was meant as a gesture of friendship. No camaraderie existed between the units, however, the two taking up positions on opposite ends of Unity City, as far apart as they could get while still remaining in reach of the royal palace.
Some 30 battlemech regiments had arrived with this first wave from the Republic, a number chosen and agreed upon by both Amaris and Cameron. It was decided that the Rimworld's troops should never outnumber their native Terran forces. However, as time passed, the abundance of Rimworld's troops became conspicuous. Across the hegemony, people were seeing foreign troops in greater and greater numbers. While 30 mech regiments was the official number, the shipping manifests all lied. Those units who were arriving had a functional strength of more than double the standard amount. Before long, 16 whole divisions were occupying defensive positions across the hegemony. In command of this massive deployment was Amaris' most trusted RWA general, Patrick Scoffins. In addition to Scoffin's troops, a further 8 divisions worth of mercenaries had been quietly moved into the hegemony, led by General Legos. They wore no uniforms at all, their weapons stored in hidden caches. This gave the Rimworld's aligned forces a 3-to-1 advantage over First Corps. Only on New Dallas were these mercenaries identified and imprisoned, putting the SLDF presence on that world on high alert.
Many veterans of the Hidden Wars would go on to operate irregular forces on their home planets after retirement. One such group was the New Dallas Rangers, whose performance and loyalty to the League could more than match any surviving and serving SLDF unit. The sudden appearance of vast numbers of Rimworld personnel was a touchy subject, and the two rarely mixed. The heightened suspicions and discipline maintained by the Rangers led them to discover the existence of a hidden mercenary force, which they promptly arrested. The irregulars could not yet prove it, but they were sure there was some connection between the Mercs and the RWA. Another few weeks might have just been enough time for them to uncover the horrible truth and potentially prevent the disastrous events that would soon unfold.
The gaps left by the departure of 10th and 21st Corps were plugged by these new troops. Over a period of 6 months, the RWA gradually moved into more and more of the castles Bryan that littered the realm, until over half were under their control. The information they had learned about these facilities after the withdrawal of 20th Army from the Republic allowed them to quickly bring the bases back online. Furthermore, the RWA was gradually infiltrating administrative branches of the Star League, and evidence of those surplus troops were being scrubbed from the systems wherever logged.
Amaris' early support within the hegemony had come through flattery, but as he began to exert his influence through the appointment of his allies to positions of power within the government, this transitioned into a more insidious form of control. Those who were not aligned with his faction could find themselves facing ever greater obstacles in their daily lives or business operations. The surveillance state he had built for himself at home had worked wonders, and Amaris sought to do the same abroad. Blackmail was not off the cards in ensuring the cooperation of those whose support he needed.
Subverting the Bureau of Star League Affairs had been a long-time goal of Amaris, something he had been using his influence to work on for years. In 2764, he had managed to appoint Duke Khalid Ueno as the director of the entire organization, a major coup for the Amaris faction. One of the new governmental positions he created was the Office of Doctrine and Policy, with Director Lisa Outerbridge at its head. She'd been Stefan's woman behind the scenes in the hegemony and Star League government for a few years by the outbreak of the Periphery Uprising. Lisa was a Free Worlds national whose personal history had caused her to become deeply hateful towards both her home realm and the Star League at large. Outerbridge's OPD was responsible for ensuring the various decrees of the First Lord, and by extension Amaris, were carried out, assigning members to every government department within the hegemony in order to do so. The other advisors closest to Amaris were intensely distrustful of the non-Rimworlder, but her proven loyalty won her a place as one of Amaris' elite 5 within his inner circle. These 6 were the architects of the Star League's downfall. The deployment and gradual takeover of so many core positions as part of Operations Harmony and Shadowplay were more or less complete by the end of 2766, leaving only one final phase, Operation Apotheosis. 2 men of note were becoming increasingly alarmed at this development, though the full scale of the shift in power remained for the time unknown to them. The first was Alexander Kerensky, who was urgently pleading with Richard Cameron to seek aid from other loyal member states such as the Federated Suns and Lyran Commonwealth, and not rely exclusively on the Rimworld's Republic, a suggestion that the First Lord deigned not to take him up on. The second was one of the Star League's arch-rivals, the coordinator of the Draconis Combine, Takiro Kurita. The ancient statesman was 120 years old in 2766 and had taken notice of Amaris's suspect maneuvers. His grandnephew, Drago Kurita, was their ambassador to the Star League, stationed at Unity City with his wife and 4 children. He had kept his coordinator well informed of the developing situation on Earth. Slowly, Takiro began to realize what was going on. Surrounded as he was by 2 neighbours with whom his realm had shared a violent and bloody history, there were few he could turn to with his suspicions. This reputation wasn't undeserved. The Combine had on numerous occasions invaded their neighbours and had been especially active during the Third Hidden War. What had been lost in the confusion of that conflict, though, was a number of false flag operations orchestrated by the Rimworlds to keep 2 of their neighbours at each other's throats and not turning their attention elsewhere. Furthermore, the movement of DCMS forces towards their borders the previous year had been exaggerated by Amaris's agents. Those emissaries that did leave the Combine were viewed as some part of a Kuritan trick, the warnings they carried dismissed as being the first part of a Draconis Combine breakaway. Internally, however, Takiro gave orders to begin the slow withdrawal of all Kuritan-affiliated personnel within the hegemony, and a gradual redeployment of DCMS troops to that border. To maintain the pretense that nothing untoward was going on, Drago Kurita remained with his family on Terra in his role.
The eventual defeat of the Periphery Uprising was inevitable from the outset. The question was simply how long the fiercely independent realms would continue to fight. The reunification war had shown just how much they would be willing to sacrifice in the name of freedom. By the end of the 2nd year, their slim hope of victory had vanished. But the fear remained within high command that the ruling families would issue a call to arms, prolong the conflict, and require the SLDF to once again unleash atrocities in order to put an end to the fighting.
Back in the Periphery, the Outworlds campaign was continuing on to its next phase. 15th Army had reached and occupied large parts of Trader's Domain, something that the Green Trader Sentinels were totally incapable of preventing. 16th pushed through the Onverwacht province and were engaged by elements of the Onverwacht Guards and their neighbouring Blomstein demons. On the Spinwood end, 20th Army advanced into the Balagora province and were challenged by the native Balagora Fusiliers. What was left of 18th Army had been liberated by this point and joined the fight in pushing Spinward. By the end of the year, around 60% of the Alliance was back under Star League control, but it had come at a heavy cost. The regular army had deployed 492 battle mech and 585 conventional regiments to the Outworlds, a grand total of 1,077 regiments. Of those, including a small number of defections, 445 had been disbanded or destroyed, most from the now virtually non-existent 18th Army. They had faced an estimated 202 regiments of irregulars, militia, turncoats, secret army masses, and the occasional strike from the AMC itself. Their losses were somewhere in the region of 180 regiments. The Outworlds campaign would ultimately prove to be the most brutal of the 3 uprisings, leading to the highest number of civilian deaths. 20th Army in particular vented their frustrations from being kicked out of the Rimworlds on the local populace. This also resulted in them receiving the highest number of casualties of any SLDF army, and a reprimand from Kerensky. Still, things were progressing at an acceptable rate, and early plans were already anticipating a phased withdrawal by the end of 2768. Admiral Brandt dispatched the more mobile armies from the Freeworlds League military region deeper into the Magistracy. Her campaign was also proceeding at a satisfactory pace, but they faced new resistance when most of the People's Volunteers joined with the Secret Army in the Rimwood half of the territorial state. Brandt began drawing up plans for a landing on Canopus, with the remnants of the 17th Army requesting to act as vanguard, still unsure whether this act would trigger the MAF to openly declare war. The invasion was penciled in for mid-2767. The Admiral had the fewest number of regiments at her disposal, though not to any serious degree. 459 battle mech and 480 conventional for a total of 939. Her losses were also the lowest, though no less severe, 391 destroyed or disbanded. The greatest number of these, unsurprisingly, were from 17th Army, who had also suffered more defections than their equivalents within the other territorial states. The Magistracy had been able to field around 230 regiments in opposition, give or take a dozen of irregulars. Of those, around 210 had been wiped out. Kerensky's army group, not unexpectedly, was having a tougher time in the Taurian Concordat. Third Army had completed their encirclement of the Badlands cluster, avoiding that maelstrom of stars just as their predecessors had in the Reunification War, and was now waiting on Serenity for 4th to reach them from the opposite direction. In the centre, the 7th were making slow progress, their proximity to the Hades cluster drawing elements of the Pleiades units of the TDF 3rd Corps into engagements with them. 6th Army had completed moving through the Brinton province, was now at the border of the Hades Union. Ahead of them lay the cursed planet where all this chaos had started, New Vandenberg. Their equivalent strength was about equal to that which had been dispatched by Forlo to take the planet 180 years earlier. The fight was not an easy one, but the Taurians had never fully recovered from their ancestors' loss, and despite being a major staging post for the Secret Army, New Vandenberg fell in January 2767. An assault on the Hades cluster lay ahead. The Taurian campaign under Kerensky had fared marginally better, but it was feared the worst was to come if they were again required to take the Hades cluster. 433 battlemech and 510 conventional regiments had been deployed so far, 943 in total, of which 419 had been lost or were to be disbanded. Irregulars, Secret Army, deserters and rogue TDF accounted for the 233 regiments that had opposed the Star League, circa 200 of which were now destroyed. The Freedom War would go to show just how big a difference leadership can have in the conduct of a war. Despite both sides having broadly similar goals to their predecessors in the Reunification War, the scale of the atrocities were far smaller and less frequent than before. Though the Ares Conventions hadn't been an official part of the SLDF doctrine for centuries, Kerensky pushed to have his troops follow their principles where possible. The Secret Army, though fanatical in their defence, were ultimately fighting for their homes and did not wish to see them bombed. The use of chemical, biological and radiological weapons was therefore far less common, and nuclear weapons too were generally restricted to the SLDF forts and castles. Nevertheless, by early 2767 the list of casualties was already in the millions, of which around 1 million were dead. Across the three fronts, the Star League had suffered 1 million casualties, a quarter of which had been declared KIA. All told, the SLDF had lost about 30% of its strength in the first 2 years of the Periphery Uprising. Things were more extreme on the opposite side. Though only slightly more casualties had been documented at 1.3 million, 750,000 of them had resulted in deaths, and almost 90% of the periphery combatants had been eliminated. There was one further development in 2766 which had the potential to change the course of Star League history. In February of that year, Richard Cameron's wife, Elise Graham, gave birth to their daughter, Amanda. Cameron had proven himself to be ill-suited to the role of First Lord, making several disastrous decisions in his short reign, but in the years since his marriage to Elise, his attitude and behaviour had mellowed considerably.
Richard Cameron was a fantasist, a man clearly in love more with his books than the immense task of running the Star League. His friendship with Amaris eroded any legitimacy he once held with the Lords of the League, and they themselves would take advantage of his weak rule the same way Amaris did. That said, the Lords themselves held little interest in the betterment of the League as a whole, preferring to focus inwards and take what they could for themselves. Truly, the League at this point was becoming less and less cohesive.
Richard had never been on good terms with any of the Council Lords, but after the birth of his daughter, he felt compelled to better that relationship, for her sake if no one else's. He reached out to each of them in turn, receiving replies that ranged from cautious to disinterested, but over the next few months, dialogues were opened that had the potential to develop into stronger alliances. One individual, the first Prince John Davian, even met with Richard Cameron on Earth. Whether any state matters were discussed is lost to history, but the conversation eventually turned to the topic of fatherhood. Davian imparted what wisdom he could on the issue, to which Richard seemed receptive. At some level, the First Lord must have sensed that something was wrong. By December 2766, only 2 battlemech and 6 infantry divisions were left within the hegemony, plus a mere 84 warships. The defence of Earth fell solely to the Zavahava division, and Unity City had only the Royal Blackwatch in garrison. Whether he was oblivious to the growing danger or was afraid to confront it, we don't know, but Cameron chose in that moment to privately appoint John Davian as the Infant Amanda's regent should anything happen to him. By all accounts, it seemed as if the Periphery Uprising would soon be winding to a close as it entered its 3rd year. The Secret Army had suffered incredible losses across all 3 theatres. So far, the territorial states had lost 600 regiments fighting the Freedom War. The SLDF had lost more than double that fighting against the Periphery Uprising, 1,255, many of those in the early days before the armies in garrison even understood what was happening. 10 entire corps had either been destroyed or suffered overwhelming casualties. The Stalag Navy had fared little better, as space was the preferred target for the Periphery's strategic weapons. 259 warships had either been destroyed or had been decommissioned. These losses weren't the only thing playing heavily on Kerensky's mind, however. After the victory at New Vandenberg, he dispatched a message to Richard Cameron to update him on the progress of the Periphery campaigns. He received no response. This didn't immediately cause him concern, as the two were not really on speaking terms. It was a rare day he actually did receive orders from the First Lord. Most of the SLDF response to the uprising had been on Alexander's own initiative. Word reached him not long afterwards, first of trouble with communications between the Terran hegemony and the wider Star League, then of a complete HPG blackout. One by one, the worlds of the hegemony were going dark, without apparent explanation. Ships were dispatched to ascertain what was happening within the core worlds. None returned. At the end of the month, the Hegemony Central Bank declined all SLDF payments, rendering the regular army and navy destitute overnight. On February 4th, 2767, Kerensky received an explanation. A message from the Inner Sphere, direct from Emperor Stefan Amaris himself. Operation Apotheosis was a success.
The strategic game of the Inner Sphere's great houses has always been about striking first, striking often, and attempting to ensure strategic primacy through overwhelming investment in strategic materials. Unfortunately, everyone else operates on the same principle, and thus the sport of the Inner Sphere is frequently war.
On December 12, 2766, a handful of nobles and high-ranking officers from within the SLDF approached the First Lord Richard Cameron. Chief among them was Colonel Hanny Schmidt of the Royal Black Watch. They had grave concerns about the number of Rimworld's army troops that had been deployed to the Terran hegemony over the last 6 months. Their reported numbers did not come close to aligning with the reality on the ground, and they urgently wished to see Cameron take action on the matter. Regrettably, the First Lord rebuffed and dismissed them. It's quite possible that Richard too was aware that something was going on. His actions earlier that year point to some level of mistrust regarding the RWA. Cameron did decide to reach out and contact another about his worries, but regrettably it was not Commanding General Alexander Kerensky, with whom he had little bond or connection, but rather the President of the Rimworld's Republic itself, his longtime friend, Stefan Amaris. He requested that the Periphery Lord come to Terra so that they might discuss the issue. When Amaris received the letter, he knew that the time had come at last to launch the final phase of his master plan, Operation Apotheosis. He first set his estates in order, asking his trusted ally Mohammed Selim to once again act as regent over the Rimworlds from his Apollo offices after Stefan departed the Republic for Terra. Most of his inner circle were already within the hegemony, but travelling with him aboard Black Shark 1 was his wife Tabori. And with that, Stefan Amaris departed the Rimworld's Republic for the last time. Escorting him to his destination were the few warships of the Rimworld's navy which were not already redeployed within the core systems. Also travelling with him were over 100 of his most trusted political officers. They carried with them the final orders for Apotheosis. Having spent the last decade training at both the occupation and assault of Castles Bryan, plus tactics for urban combat and riot suppression, most of the RWA had already deduced what was coming. The Terror kept any from speaking out, though it's probable most agreed with Amaris' plans. He arrived in Earth orbit on Christmas Day 2766, but his final landing would be delayed until late Boxing Day evening on account of the terrible snowstorm currently enveloping Unity City. While he waited, he recorded a friendly holiday greeting to his troops stationed across the hegemony and dispatched it using the highest priority HPG networks. Inwardly, he must have been amused that fate had delayed him another 24 hours, but there was no real concern. Every piece was in place, and anyone who could stop him had long since been dealt with. His Christmas wishes contained a hidden message, the time and date for apotheosis, December 27th, 1700 Terra Standard Time. As H-hour approached, all across the realm, the Rimworld's army was taken to the field in force, in what they declared were simply military training maneuvers. Meanwhile, officers prepared their commando teams for their first objectives. The Hyperpulse generator network was lightly garrisoned. Many were protected by RWA squads, or with teams in the vicinity. This was true of every facility within the hegemony, as had been orchestrated by Amaris and his generals. Even the two facilities on Terra at Geneva and Tacoma were targeted. 60 minutes before H-hour, the first preliminary actions began. The simultaneous strikes against every HPG station kicked off events that were about to send the entire Star League into chaos. Within minutes, almost the entire Terran hegemony had been cut off from the rest of humanity, though it would take hours for the first failed communications to be noticed by the rest of the Inner Sphere. In most instances, the facilities were pacified with a minimum of bloodshed. Within 12 hours they would be brought back online, but firmly under Rimworld's control. Only a few threw up complications. After the discovery of the mercenary infiltrators earlier in 2766, the New Dallas militia was on high alert. When the commando assault on the HPG began, they responded in force. This in turn forced RWA General Victoria Bembaldo to act on contingency plans, sending the 154th Amaris Dragoons to detonate the facility rather than let them get the word out. Similar difficulties were faced on Asimar, resulting in the same destruction. On Kaf, the 118th Dragoons were unknowingly being shadowed by the 3378th Special Forces Battalion. The SAS troops had begun stalking the RWA regiment on their training maneuvers merely as an exercise of their own, but upon seeing them move into position near the capital, their suspicions spiked. When the attack on the HPG station began, the 3378th immediately retaliated, catching the Rimworld's forces by surprise. Again, the fallback plan was executed and the facility destroyed before word could be sent out. Only on Dayron were there complications of a different nature. General Tolston Yukai, in charge of Rimworld's operations on the ground, did not commence his attack when he should have. Whether this is because of a breakdown in communications or an error in interpreting his orders isn't known. As facilities across the hegemony were going dark, Yukai's commandos waited, and the Dayron station remained operational.
The Star League Civil War was the first major conflict to be fought since the invention of hyperpulse generators. These devices for transmitting messages across vast stretches of space, up to 60 light-years, would revolutionize the way such wars were fought, to the point where the alternatives seem absurdly antiquated. Some conspiracy theorists even question whether the early wars of man's expansion into space actually took place. After all, how could the militaries of these proto-states coordinate their actions across star systems without the existence of the HPGs? While military strategists in the 28th century salivated at the new potential they offered, they hadn't contemplated the complications that would now arise in the event that access to the network was cut off. The old method of chaining courier jump ships to relay a message, affectionately known as the Pony Express, had fallen out of practice, the costs too high to justify when the HPGs were becoming so ubiquitous. During the Reunification War, the SLDF had trial technology during Operation Mailed Fist, known as Black Boxes. These precursors to the later Star League communications network allowed for small but useful bursts of data to be sent instantaneously in much the same way. Ultimately, they were discontinued after the emergence of better alternatives. Had the SLDF maintained even a handful of these small but portable devices, Amaris's blackout would not have had nearly the same success. As it was though, the entire Inner Sphere learned at once how reliant they had become on hyperpulse technology, and the dangers they would face should they lose access to it.
The second phase of apotheosis began within 30 minutes of the HPG strikes, though the precise time varied between systems. Every major SLM presence within the Terran hegemony was being tracked and shadowed by a larger RWN consignment. Furthermore, along the border with the rest of the Inner Sphere, warships were in position to lock down all standard jump points. Every other system had a handful of assault dropships in place ready to do the same. Despite having a navy second only to the SLN in size, the RWN could only achieve their local superiority through the sudden reactivation of over 100 warships of the Starleague Reserve Fleet. The naval action began when Rimworld's ships suddenly declared a state of emergency, demanding that all jump ships in the vicinity shut down and prepare to be boarded. Simultaneously, saboteurs and infiltrators within the crews of the recharging or defense stations assisted marine detachments in seizing and shutting down those space facilities. Any who did not comply were branded terrorists and ruthlessly destroyed. Even still, many ships with an active charge available attempted to jump away, only to materialize in a neighbouring system experiencing the same situation. Very few jumped into another member state, bringing only fractious reports on what had happened. In the Dayron system, the jump points were quickly subdued, but the distress calls soon reached the planet itself, as they did in many systems. General Yukai leapt into action, but was beaten to the punch by Governor Paulo Varelas, who desperately sent HPG messages to every planet in range. Unfortunately for those on Dayron, every other world had already been cut off, and the facility was destroyed minutes later by RWA commandos. Most of the warship engagements came down decisively in favour of the RWN. 20 such battles were fought between the fleets of the Starleague and those of the Rimworlds. 17 of those were small affairs involving only 1 to 3 SLM warships of the garrison fleet, and just enough opponents to overwhelm them. Those civilians who witnessed the naval ambushes quickly realised that there was no state of emergency as declared by the periphery ships, but the sight of those monstrous vessels slugging it out made them acutely aware of how powerless they were to stop things. Outside of the Sol system, only 2 engagements were of particular note. At Erai, Commodore Justine Campos led a 6-vessel flotilla escorting a supply convoy bound for the SLDF forces out in the periphery. They suddenly found themselves under attack by the Rimworld's navy, and Campos led her ships into a close-range engagement. Though they had a slight numerical advantage, possessing 1 more warship than the RWN, they were down on overall tonnage. Nevertheless, the skill of the Starleague crew saw them destroy the heavier vessels. This brought them just 10 minutes, enough time for the supply convoy to escape into deep space, but the 2 surviving warships were soon overrun and destroyed by the remaining Rimworld's assault dropships. The battle at New Earth was the largest naval engagement since the Reunification War, a distinction it would hold for less than an hour. 20 RWN warships were poised and ready to launch their assault on what was the second most important planet within the Terran hegemony. In system was another supply convoy, this one led by Commodore Altran Serdamba, with a larger escort of 14 vessels. His flagship was the Luxor-class heavy cruiser, SLS Vandenberg. This was one of the newer classes of vessel within the Starleague Navy, a product of political backdoor dealing perpetrated by Craig Kovacs and his allies at Mitchell Vehicles, but nevertheless it was an extremely capable warship. It might have been an even fight, were it not for a recent arrival that threatened to throw the Rimworld's plans into disarray. Admiral Franziska Niemanen of 9th Fleet was over 80 years old and had recently announced her intention to retire. On his way to replace her was Vice Admiral Dimitrios Romulo. He had just left Terra aboard his Texas-class flagship SLS Wales, and had joined as escort another trio of warships to Serdamba's convoy. They were waiting for the last of the supply dropships to assemble when the RWN struck. Their first targets were the 2 flagships, but the Commodore's flotilla had been in the middle of combat drills and responded almost immediately to the attack. This gave the Admiral's crew time to reach their own ready stations. Once they joined the fray, the heavier Starleague vessels gained the upper hand. Over the course of the next half hour, the 2 fought a vicious battle, during which Romulo lost his Congress-class frigate, whereas Serdamba's comparatively lighter flotilla lost a further 7 craft. The RWN by comparison suffered the loss of 14 warships before they withdrew. Still in the dark as to what the wider objective was, Romulo ordered the surviving escort flotilla to secure the Apollo 4 shipyards, while his SLS Wales and the supply convoy prepared to depart the system altogether, leaving for a hidden facility within the hegemony a day later. The jump points within the Terran system itself came under the same attacks as were happening elsewhere across the hegemony. The first targets were the twin space stations, Versailles at the Zenith and Brandenburg at the Nadir. Since these were primarily civilian structures, they were taken over in short order by the RWA Marine detachments. Simultaneously, the dozens of SLS vessels at the jump points came under assault. The primary targets were the rare warships housing HPGs. Nuclear weapons were used liberally to ensure that no warnings reached Earth, though the HPG stations had already been taken over 30 minutes earlier. The only facility still operational was the SLDF headquarters outside the War Academy on Mars, which was beyond the reach of the RWA commandos. That complex would be dealt with in the coming hour. Despite the loss of hyperpulse communications, the Starleague could still communicate using traditional means. Even travelling at the speed of light though, the warnings would take hours to reach Earth. Those ships that survived the initial blasts engaged their attackers. They lasted only a few minutes, giving their lives so unarmed civilian and government jump ships could escape the system. Unfortunately, those ships soon materialised in the middle of other battles at their neighbouring systems. As H-Hour approached, the only Starleague naval assets left within the hegemony besides those fighting at New Earth were the ships deep within the Terran system, still blissfully unaware of the danger. Stefan Amaris and his escort marched across a sunny city plaza, blanketed in a crisp layer of snow. He had scheduled a meeting with Richard Cameron at 9 AM local time. Though late to the Christmas party, it would not do to arrive at the First Lord's chamber without bearing a gift, which is precisely what Amaris carried with him. Looking up at the sky, Stefan searched for any signs that things were not going to plan, but all was quiet. He'd received confirmation that the Geneva and Tacoma HPGs were offline, but as far as events in space went, he was as in the dark as everyone else. Responsible for the defense of Unity City was the Royal Blackwatch, arguably the most elite force within the entire SLDF. Every mech warrior in the regiment was a graduate of the Gunslinger program. 2 battalions of mechs had the wider responsibility of defending the city, while a battalion of jump infantry acted as the palace guard. With H-Hour just minutes away, 1 mech battalion was currently patrolling in isolated lances, while another was holed up in their barracks at Fort Cameron, just south of the city. Above the city, a Blackwatch fighter squadron kept vigil. As the Rimworld's president entered the royal palace, the guards posted at the entryway granted him and his retinue access without complaint. Such was Amaris's familiarity around the court of the Starleague. As he strode through the halls towards the throne room, he glanced around at the hidden emplacements, foxholes and archaic arrow slits, each concealing loyal Cameron troops. None moved to stop him. 5 minutes before H-Hour, many of the RWM warships at the Zenith and Nadir jumped to proximity Lagrange points closer to Terra, joining forces with fresh Rimworld's vessels awaiting their arrival. Their second wave of objectives included Mars and Venus, plus Columbus Station and the Ian Cameron shipyards in orbit above them. The planets themselves were quickly subjected to orbital bombardments and nuclear strikes, the most important target of which was the SLDF HPG on Mars. Again, conventional transmissions were dispatched, but would take precious minutes to reach those stationed on Earth. As the Rimworlders turned their attention next to the orbital facilities, more warships were jumping from the outer reaches of the system to pirate points above Terra. At Columbus Station, 14 warships were destroyed while still docked at the Naval Command Base, only 2 escaping the nuclear detonations to join with the 7 patrolling vessels to put up a desperate but short-lived defense. At the shipyards, the RWN took careful aim only to destroy defensive installations while leaving the 17 incomplete or unoccupied warships undergoing service intact. Marines moved to take control of the facility for themselves.
The Ares Conventions were an interesting idea. After Tentavel was rendered into the past tense, the great houses of the Inner Sphere realized 2 things. 1, it was entirely possible to reduce a strategic objective into a skid mark by employing the full weight of your arsenal, and 2, irradiated craters typically aren't valuable as strategic objectives. Thus, we have the Ares Conventions. Or as I like to see them, the Ares Guidelines. Because paper does not beat rock Anywhere outside of children's games, the Ares conventions were at best a common understanding to the conduct of conflict to ensure that targets remained whole and capturable instead of past tense and largely vapor. The Ares conventions governed war by informing warring parties of standards in conflict, which would be independently observed, and if everyone agreed, there would be more than enough conquest for everyone without the threat of glassing ourselves into the Stone Age. At least, that was the theory. That's not to say the Ares conventions were perfect. They weren't. The Ares conventions were in fact a strategic feel-good measure, which never really definitively stopped the excesses of war. It merely identified that excess for all to see. The preamble to the Ares conventions states that we, the undersigned, on this 13th day of June 2412, in accordance with our commitment to preserving human life, do solemnly pledge to prevent the loss of civilian life in war. Let this document testify to our desire to end these senseless atrocities attendant upon human conflict and our pledge to uphold the ideals contained within this convention or suffer the harshest of consequences. While lofty, these words were hollow. Of these 6 articles, 18 appendices, and 320 pages, the Ares conventions were signed, and then, immediately thereafter, violated. Those states who did not sign were historically vindicated by their abstaining. They believed that the conventions would legitimize warfare, and if anything, push people's grievances toward conflict as a viable solution in all cases, which sadly, they did. The Ares conventions allowed for the great houses to do largely whatever they had been doing, but with rules that ensured their conquests would not be rolled back by maximal strategic response. And when they formed the Star League, they ensured the conventions were immediately retired. Rescinding the Ares conventions at the dawn of the Star League allowed for the great houses to fight total war, unrestricted upon anyone deemed to be working against the good of the state. And as such, I feel the great houses of the Inner Sphere rightfully inherited the consequences of their actions. Some call this karma. I, as a citizen of the periphery, call it justice. For they had set themselves up to be the rightful conquerors of everything, far too late to realize that unifying the Inner Sphere under force of arms was never going to last, and that war is seldom meaningfully governed by the rules of politicians. Remember, while the rules governing conflict may mutate over time, war itself doesn't change all that frequently. In the end, it's about real estate and how much blood you're willing to wager to have a chance at getting it.
Stefan met Richard within the throne room. The First Lord was thrilled to see his friend again after more than 2 years. Without delay, Amaris proffered up his present, which Cameron enthusiastically accepted and unwrapped. Within the many layers of nested boxes and wrapping, he found the true gift. An ornately carved laser pistol, covered in gems and bearing the crests of both House Amaris and the Star League. Smiling, Amaris took hold of the weapon and raised it aloft so that the early morning sun reflected off the many jewels. The assorted flags of the Star League began softly trembling as the first distant explosions reached those within the audience chamber. Similar detonations were occurring at key installations across the planet and the wider hegemony. Amaris spoke in a soft whisper. "It has begun."
H-hour. It was the moment that the Amaris family had been building toward for generations. Plans set in motion more than a century earlier finally came to fruition, and the Cameron Star League would now receive their just desserts. But despite their efforts, the Amarises almost came undone in the face of incredible resistance from the hopelessly outnumbered SLDF defenders. Apotheosis would go down as one of the best executed military coups in history, and yet for those first 24 hours, the entire operation balanced on a knife's edge. The events of the mayor's coup are legendary. Every schoolboy knows what transpired inside the throne room at Unity City on that terrible day. But with such an infamous event, it can be easy to forget that those who lived through it were not aware of what had transpired until long afterwards. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see ways in which the SLDF could have brought the Amaris takeover to a swift end. But in that moment, their sole focus was reaching and ensuring the safety of the First Lord, a goal that, unbeknownst to them, was beyond their abilities from the very start.
1,000 pieces of Operation Apotheosis were about to move in perfect synchronicity, kicking off 100,000 reactionary moves. The 24 divisions under the command of Generals Scoffins and Legos were strategically placed to overwhelm the defending regular army in as short order as possible, but they had a mammoth task ahead of them. While Apotheosis called for a complete takeover of the entire hegemony, the true fight was always going to take place on humanity's homeworld. Terra was at the time the most heavily defended planet in existence. In addition to the commercial and government transfer stations, 5 orbital defense stations were on various paths above the planet, commanded by the Mets in high geosynchronous orbit. The Starleague Navy had dozens of warships, hundreds of dropships, and thousands of aerospace fighters on hand, organized into the 1st Star Squadron and 14th Line Squadron. SLS Starleague and Enterprise were 2 of the 5 vessels comprising the emergency command post. Lastly, the Reagan Space Defense System, the most expansive and advanced STS in operation, would make short work of any hostile naval forces. On the ground, the Zavahava Division was deployed across the planet at key sites. Originally intended to deploy just within North America, the unit was now stretched thin thanks to the Periphery Uprising. Their headquarters at Fort Knox was far across the continent, but several regiments were stationed near Unity City at Tacoma's Fort McKenna and the Mount Baker Castle Bryan, the latter serving as a secondary HQ in the event that the Citadel went offline.
When the Rim World's army struck Terra, they understood that despite their numerical advantage, the success of the coup was not guaranteed. The Starleague Defense Force kept many of their best formations stationed on Terra, and this said nothing of other localized forces that fell under the umbrella of the Terran Armed Forces. Victory could be achieved nonetheless if they deprived these troops of their greatest assets, their organization and communications, as well as hitting their opposition before they knew what was happening, using the element of surprise. Despite at this time not being considered comparable in quality to the soldiers of the Starleague Defense Forces, the Rimworld's army was not so foolish as to enter this kind of operation without a plan for thorough victory. Taking out the hyperpulse generators to cut off interplanetary communications was an element of this, isolating Terra itself to prevent any kind of relief, should the coup go awry, as well as adding to the cloud of confusion that their victims would suffer. The second phase was to eliminate as many of the SLDF's top officers in the opening minutes as they could, which would cause the breakdown in organization they required to isolate and eliminate Terra's best and last defenders. This latter task would be achieved in a multitude of ways. Just as Operation Guillotine had heralded the arrival of the secret army during the Periphery Uprising, H-Hour was marked by the death of several high-ranking generals and colonels, often assassinated by Rimworld's agents either embedded in their staff or by their once-thought-of allies in the Rimworld's army. By cutting off the head, it left the main strength of the SLDF on-world floundering within their forts and castles, awaiting orders that would never come.
The first wave of explosions that shook Unity City, bombs planted in the weeks and months preceding Operation Apotheosis, targeted key installations and infrastructure that would limit the speed at which the isolated SLDF forces could consolidate and move to defensive positions. Seconds after H-Hour, the sensors built into the walls of the throne room reported that a firefight had broken out, the First Lord was in danger. The shock lasted mere moments before the elite Blackwatch responded. Colonel Schmidt and her mech warriors raced to suit up and move on the court of the Star League. Within the royal palace itself, the Blackwatch infantry sprinted towards the audience chamber in an attempt to secure the First Lord. They immediately came under fire from the palace's own defense turrets, emplacements that could only be reprogrammed from within the throne room, suggesting that Amaris and his team had overwhelmed the personal bodyguard of Richard Cameron. The Blackwatch were cut down in droves, only 3 of the first platoon making it to the doors, where they were killed by the 4 RWA soldiers inside. The heavy doors were then locked from within, forcing a different approach. The 4 defense stations in low orbit were nuked simultaneously, destroying 2 of them outright, while the others were left heavily damaged. Amaris's warships stationed over Luna also took the opportunity to launch strategic weapons at the 2 major SLDF bases on the surface, before moving to reinforce their RWN allies nearby. As it happened all over the hegemony during the past 60 minutes, the 2 navies clashed bitterly, though the Star League flagships would survive the initial ambush. The patrolling aerospace squadron over Unity City spotted the 4th Amaris Dragoons approaching the city from their base to the north, but came under attack at the same time by the reprogrammed anti-air turrets and an air wing of Rimworld's fighters. They were shot down in the opening minutes, giving Amaris early control of the skies, though the Blackwatch ground aero wing at Fort Cameron was preparing to take to the air. All this was witnessed by the Blackwatch jump infantry leaping across the rooftops of the royal court. They had to stay dangerously close to the surface to keep below the firing arcs of the anti-air emplacements. The hostile aerospace fighters darted overhead, making a beeline for Fort Cameron. The Blackwatch infantry pressed ahead. The shockwave of a nuclear explosion flattened the jump troopers to the roof of the complex. Looking behind them, they saw a mushroom cloud ascending over the smoking ruins of Fort Cameron. The first wartime detonation to shake Earth in over 800 years had just gone off at the heart of the Star League. Among those incinerated in the blast were the entire aerospace complement of the Blackwatch, and a full battalion of mechs, save for 9 mech warriors who were fast enough to have already left the base before detonation. Sergeants Carlson, Fettel, Hicks and Southern, Lieutenants Suarez and Yanez, Majors Campbell and McFadden, and Colonel Schmidt herself. Emerging from the fire though was the 30-story monolith that was the Citadel, standing defiantly against the blast. Within the Citadel though, personnel were thrown against the walls by the concussive forces, injuring many. This was followed up by internal explosions, suicide vests worn by the Rimworld's liaisons visiting the complex. Their main targets were the SDS command controls and the Intelligence Fusion Center. Major General Elena Kursata made use of the confusion to fatally stab SLDF Chief of Staff General Tomohiro Musuibe, killing the most senior member of High Command not deployed within the periphery. Across the planet, similar explosions were going off at other priority targets. Chemical and biological weapons were also employed to quickly subdue SLDF forces at the 4 backup SDS command centers at the Megadi, Manaus, Takayama and Whitecliffs Castle Bryan. Where those failed, the RWA turned to nuclear or orbital strikes in order to level the facilities. With that, the space defense systems were brought temporarily offline, beginning the space battle in earnest.
The Space Defense System, or SDS for short, was one of the hegemony's crown jewels in terms of its defense. Jonathan Cameron envisioned a grand automated defensive sphere for his realm, and Usopp Robotics and the Nirasaki Computers Collective would provide. The SDS was highly advanced, bordering on true artificial intelligence, capable of engaging human admirals via a networked battle computer that could draw upon digitized tactics of the best admirals in the SLDF. The system consisted of orbital bases armed with naval-class weaponry, drone warships that carried more firepower than most human-crewed vessels, and supported by numerous drone fighters. The system was extended to ground platforms, capable of firing heavy weaponry from the surface accurately toward orbiting enemy fleets. All of this created a veneer of safety. Should the unthinkable happen where the SLDF fleet would be defeated, the hegemony would remain safe, protected by its AI navy at every jump point. The fact remained, however, that such an advanced system was still reliant on human operators. Amaris's coup would rely heavily on gaining control of this powerful weapon system, and many sites would fall to coordinated attack or through espionage and attacks from within by Republican spies and assault teams. Ultimately, the SDS as a grand shield for the hegemony would be defeated from within. No one at the time of its creation would have believed a foreign power would be allowed such access to the inner workings of the hegemony, and thus the system's greatest weakness would be exploited. Of course, much of this can be laid at Richard Cameron's feet. His naive trust in Amaris would allow him great influence and access to the delicate systems of Terra's defense.
10 minutes after H-hour, the Rimworld's fighters reached Mount Baker and made 3 consecutive nuclear airdrops against the main entrances to that Castle Bryan, severely limiting how quickly the Zavahava division could deploy to assist Unity City. These detonations were seen and felt by the jump infantry who had made it to the roof of the throne room, where they began to cut down into the ceiling. The other castles Bryan on Terra were targeted in like fashion, the surface levels of many reduced to smoking craters early in the battle. Within the Citadel CIC, Major General R.J. Amadolu had the unfortunate task of trying to coordinate the desperate defense of Earth. His first move was to issue a call to arms, commanding all staff at the base to grab a weapon and prepare to defend the facility. He also ordered a priority evacuation of all High Command generals from the Citadel to Mount Baker. 9 were still alive somewhere in the complex, but only the Director of Administrative Command had so far been located. The city police force, meanwhile, was deploying to defend civilian infrastructure and erecting barricades around the Royal Palace. Emerging from Black Shark 1 and its escort dropships at Unity City Spaceport was a full battalion of RWA battle mechs and 2 companies of mechanized infantry. The mechs moved into the city to locate and destroy the isolated Blackwatch patrols, whereas the APCs raced at full speed towards the palace in an effort to reinforce Amaris. Colonel Schmidt was leading our 2 Lancers to block the 4th Dragoons from entering the city. A strategic bottleneck existed at Gorst Flats, which would give our superior Royal Battle Mechs some small chance at victory over the approaching regiment. Major John Dollard's lead company was the first to be engaged, all 12 mechs ripped to shreds in just a few minutes by overwhelming firepower. Captain Linda MacDonald's company attempted to reinforce them, but they too suffered heavy casualties before Colonel Armstrong Ducat ordered a withdrawal. With the SLDF numbers dwindling fast, those within the Citadel took desperate action to try and secure the city. Personnel within the complex left the shielded interior for the nuclear inferno at their doorstep, sacrificing their lives to the radioactive Terra in an effort to clear some of the debris scattered across Fort Cameron's airstrip. If it could be cleared, aerospace fighters and dropships housed in underground hangars beneath the Citadel could be brought into the fight. At Gorst Flats, an attempt to flank the Blackwatch position was driven off. The Dragoons were falling victim to their own targeted destruction of infrastructure, unable to enter the city by any path other than through the unflinching Blackwatch. Ducat called in nearby aerospace fighters, but their first strafing run proved as ineffectual as all prior attempts to dislodge Schmidt and her company. Faced with a seemingly insurmountable defense, the Dragoons got desperate. A second nuclear detonation buffeted Unity City, as Hanny Schmidt and her 8 companions were erased from existence in another blast. Any Dragoon survivors from Dollard's and MacDonald's companies were likewise incinerated. Between the 2 explosions, a third of the quarter of the Star League had been razed to the ground. Unity City was the centre of Star League government, but the Terran hegemony was run from the capital of Geneva. Defending the government complex were the 1st Royal Swiss Cavalry, who soon found themselves under siege from the 17th Amaris Legionnaires and 85th Amaris Fusiliers. The Rimworld's president had given special instructions not to destroy any of the buildings at Geneva, but this made their lives extremely challenging when facing off against the elite Swiss regiment.
One of the more touchy subjects when it comes to war, and one that is often overlooked until after the ashes settle, the cost on civilians. For Terra, those not living in Unity City, Seattle, Tacoma, the greater Puget Sound areas, and the SLDF military bases and reserves, most likely they would not even be aware that there was a coup. When Amaris did get around to addressing the planet as to the events, obviously lying by omission, and presented himself like a specific comic book villain, claimed he gave the hegemony back to the people. Some of you might think the Bloody Usurper would have gone full nihilist and saw anyone in the Terran hegemony as a cancer to be eradicated. In truth, as megalomaniacal as Amaris was, he knew ruling over graveyards was counter to the definition of taking power. The man was greedy for absolute control, and as such, his focus was on the people that would threaten that. When the day came for the coup, it would be the SLDF personnel that would see chemical weapons and nuclear fire consume the Star League. Nuclear weapons would be deployed soon after the coup began, starting with Unity City. A handful of nukes would be used to erase most of the city, as Amaris would remark it as the corrupt icon of the Star League and House Cameron. More nukes would be used in and around Unity City, as the primary counterforces to Amaris was the legendary Black Watch, the royal guard of the First Lord, even so far as expending a nuke to destroy just 8 Black Watch mechs and their commander. Further destruction would come in the form of chemical and nuclear weapons being used on the 20 castles Brian across Terra, aiming to wipe out any and all SLDF forces and material in the hegemony, the goal to make Amaris' own army the sole combat-ready forces in the region. Across the rest of the hegemony, similar rules of engagement were carried out by Amaris' forces, using total unrestricted warfare against the SLDF bases and personnel. Also taking place on Terra and surrounding spaces was the eradication of government officials by the activation of sleeper agents triggering explosives, conducting assassinations, and any other means of removing people that would threaten Amaris' consolidation of power. Beyond this, one can say that those in government Amaris eliminated was as far as the casualties to civilian populations went. While mostly true, extra casualties came from the guerrilla resistance across the planet and hegemony. Some lasted longer than others, but Amaris and his armies would eliminate anyone who would not simply bow to his new regime. While on a revenge-fueled crusade for a past perceived scorning, Amaris was not an idiot. He needed people behind him that were not directly in his pocket to support his rule. If he had the support or apathy of the people, the only people to oppose him would be the survivors of the SLDF, a group he could easily disavow in public addresses to spin his truth to his favor. And he did exactly that. The common folk of the hegemony were either curious, apathetic, or shared Amaris' disdain for the Cameron family in some form or another, as all Amaris wanted the people to see was him as the great savior of the hegemony.
Within the ruined city, barely a handful of Blackwatch mechs were still up, most picked off by the attacking squadrons or the mechs disgorged by Amaris' landed ships. On the roof of the royal court, the jump infantry finally cut through the last layer of the ceiling. They were coming under increasing fire from the mechanized infantry that had broken through the perimeter defenses established by the police. The Blackwatch infantry lowered explosives into the hollow wall as the first step of their breach. The wall housing the royal court turret defense controls was blown open, sending debris flying into the throne room itself. The blast killed 2 of Stefan's bodyguards, and Amaris only survived because he was shielded by the throne. But the hole wasn't yet large enough for the jump infantry to climb through and reach the First Lord. With the arrival of yet more RWA troops, and even some mechs, the Blackwatch infantry was falling fast at their exposed position on the roof, the last few rappelling down into the halls outside the audience chamber. As they were preparing another breaching charge, a Rimworld's APC crashed through the palace walls and into the interior, where a desperate firefight ensued. Amaris, far from cowering in the throne room as is sometimes reported, armed himself with a jeweled laser pistol and stepped through the doors. He was greeted by the sight of his officers standing proudly atop the corpses of the last of the Blackwatch, killed just out of reach of their sovereign. The royal court was now securely in Amaris' hands. In space, Major General Gruber was directing the naval actions from his post on the Met's orbital defense station, but his geostationary position, coupled with the loss of several closer installations, gave him only half the picture, blind to the events on the far side of the planet. The Rimworld's navy, meanwhile, was taking a real pounding from the SLN despite their numbers advantage. High Command was now racing through the Maglev tunnels beneath Puget Sound towards Fort McKenna, with the plan to continue on to Mount Baker afterwards. To buy them time, the staff at the Citadel would continue to hold on for as long as possible. Despite the nuclear detonation, they still remained one of the most operational command facilities on planet. Their next goal was to launch an attempt to retake areas of Unity City. Emerging from underground bunkers, the high-ranking officers of the Citadel took to the field with their own personal rides kept on station for training purposes. 23 aerospace fighters used the newly cleared runway to take to the skies, followed by 7 assault dropships. Within the next few minutes, 2 squadrons of Rimworld's fighters were brought down. The SLDF craft then turned towards the 4th Amaris Dragoons. On the ground, 42 battle mechs pushed out into Unity City in twin lance formations, each mech warrior a senior staff officer within the regular army. The Amaris Regiment was forced to deploy their entire strength within the city themselves to meet this new challenge.
The Republic's principal aim was to ensure that they did not provoke any further response than absolutely necessary. Terra at the time was protected not just by the SLDF and the Terran state, but also by hundreds of militia regiments. These were loyal not to the Star League or First Lord, but to the administrative districts they called home, the nation-states of Old Earth. By keeping collateral damage to a minimum, they gave these units no reason to involve themselves, especially when so many of the planet's nobility and bureaucrats declared their support for Amaris within the first 24 hours. This restraint, unfortunately for the denizens of Unity City, was not applied to the seat of power of the Star League or the city around it, and this region would be attacked without caution or concern for the lives of the people who called this place home. Had Amaris and his military not handled this situation with care, it is very probable that Terra would have taken significantly longer to subdue, and substantially more resources. By striking at the right moment, by striking from within, and otherwise by surprise, and only against their intended targets, the Rimworld's army achieved a strategic victory over the defenders that cannot be overstated.
1 hour after Operation Apotheosis had begun, the situation for the Star League was dire. By now, the majority of the hegemony planetary capitals were under Rimworld's control, many surrendered without a fight by anti-Cameron governors, and most of the SLDF concentrations had been destroyed. The Ian Cameron shipyards had been successfully captured without the loss of any of the parked warships, granting the RWN access to these vessels. Fort McKenna was now under heavy attack by the 9th Amaris Dragoons, but High Command had already begun the 50-kilometre journey toward the Mount Baker Castle Bryan, arriving before the end of the hour. Unfortunately, as it became clear that McKenna was going to fall, the decision was made to seal the tunnels between there and the Citadel, effectively cutting off everyone still within the facility. It was around this time that the first HPG stations outside the hegemony were noticing the lack of broadcasts from within, though it would take another hour for them to realise that something was seriously wrong. Above Terra, the naval battle was going firmly in favour of the Star League Navy. Half of the Rimworld's warships had been destroyed in the first 60 minutes, at the loss of comparatively few SLN ships. At this juncture though, Vice Admiral Constance Peterson made a critical error. She split the Star Squadron in two and dispatched them to take up positions above the capitals of Unity City and Geneva. The latter used orbital strikes to great effect, causing significant damage to the Fusiliers and Legionnaires below. This defensive position gave Rimworld's Admiral Geoffrey Coultier time to establish a local numerical superiority and assault the SLN above Puget Sound. SLS Star League and that half of the squadron was destroyed entirely. Racing to their aid was Vice Admiral Santiago Markevich and the 14th Line, who made the RWN pay dearly, destroying the flagship of their entire navy, the brand new RWS Stefan Amaris. At this point in the battle for Terra, the controversial decision was made to evacuate the majority of High Command from the planet altogether. The Citadel called in SLS Enterprise and its escorts to hold position and provide cover over Mount Baker, but this exposed several vulnerabilities that the RWN were quick to exploit. Chiefly, without additional support, the Messina and Sumter orbital defense stations were destroyed, leaving only the distant Mets beyond the range of most of the fighting. After almost an hour of delays, the dropships carrying High Command finally departed from their hidden launch platforms within the mountainous Castle Bryan. Of those members of High Command who had been on Earth when the attacks began, 7 of the 9 survivors were aboard the dropships. Despite the friendly air assets from Puget Sound redeploying to assist, the delay had given the Rimwelders time to maneuver their own reinforcements. 2 of the dropships were destroyed outright, while another, carrying Director of Quartermaster Command Aslan Liebeck, crash-landed in central Canada. The 4 that made it to space docked with 2 of the waiting warships, but unfortunately, one of these warships exploded moments after the generals came aboard. A mere 3 ships remained in the 14th Line Squadron, the SLS Enterprise, Theodore Logan, and Kharkov, the latter carrying Directors Sergei Aruzho of the Judge Advocate General Command and Kim Hyung-suk of the Replacement Deployment Command. 90 minutes after being called in to perform the priority evacuation, the surviving warships were disengaging, withdrawing towards the Lagrange point, ready to jump out of system. While the traditional jump points had by this point all been secured by the RWN, there was nothing to stop ships from going further out into deep space, or using uncharted or uncolonized systems to get around. The Kharkov did just that, after which the Enterprise and its sole remaining escort turned and headed back towards the Mets to rearm. General Tamerlan Stephenson, Director of Royal Command, was one of 2 members of High Command who had chose to remain on Earth, now the man notionally in charge of the defense of the planet from his fortress at Mount Baker. He ordered his troops to resist the usurper Stephen Amaris and his malevolent thugs at all costs. However, around this time, Amaris made his first declaration since the beginning of the conflict, threatening to kill Richard Cameron if those within Unity City didn't surrender. Unfortunately, many did, and soon suffered the consequences, executed by Rimwell's troops shortly afterwards. Only the Citadel now stood in defiance. The situation at Geneva took a sudden turn for the worse when the Star Squadron suddenly came under fire from the dormant SDS ships which had been brought back online by the RWA. 2 Congress-class frigates were destroyed before the survivors withdrew towards the Mets to regroup with SLS Enterprise. This gave the RWN an opportunity to move their own warships in and launch precision strikes against the Swiss cavalry on the ground, but the regular army troops managed to evade destruction for the time being. Only the arrival of 2 mercenary regiments, the 2nd Legion of Fire and General Antilos Legos' own Greenhaven Gestapo, gave the Rimwelds enough force on hand to overrun and destroy the 1st Royal Swiss Cavalry, securing the centre of the Terran hegemony.
Antilos Legos. Where to begin with someone so infamous? The best place would be the beginning, I suppose. Many believe Antilos Legos was born into the warlike society of the Rimworld's Republic, being brought up in the kill or be killed environment of the so-called barbaric periphery state, making him a monster from a young age. But the truth is somewhat more disturbing. His place of birth was, in actuality, in the comparatively affluent and cultured Free Worlds League in the Abbey District. Other historians have suggested his morality may have been influenced by the dictatorship of the district during his formative years. However, I would like to suggest, personally, that some people are just born evil. Although numerous Holovid series have portrayed the man as some sort of genocidal maniac cackling as he shouts his orders to his underlings, the truth is again more unnerving. Antilos was in reality a very rational and unempathetic individual. His future actions would be ordered and condoned not out of madness or anger toward the Star League, but from a cold point of logic. The terror he could instill was his end goal, and he was willing to achieve it via any means. Details of his formative years are extremely scarce, with the only reliable source of his actions prior to becoming a mercenary are records of arrests for gang-related activity. Some sources claim he was responsible for his father's death due to abuse he may have suffered at a young age, but there is little to no evidence of this being the case. Reports from the Free Worlds League militia regarding employment of the mercenary unit Hudson's Legion confirm Antilos was a member of the unit, taking part in operations against the Lyran Commonwealth and the SRDF in the Third Hidden War. He was reported to be an efficient combatant who resorted to brutal methods to achieve victory, though these actions aren't fully detailed. Regardless, they would eventually result in his dismissal from the Legion, where he would form his own mercenary command in 2750, registering under the name as Legos's Lancers. Again, details of the unit's actions are few and far between, but on Novara, the infamous Greenhaven Gestapo name would be coined. During a garrison contract, Antelos ordered his troops to beat any who would break curfew and execute anyone they found guilty of minor infractions. A riot was narrowly averted when the mayor of the city publicly condemned the actions of the Lancers, likening them to the Gestapo. Rather than taking the remark as the insult it was intended as, Antelos is said to have smiled, and after forcing the buyout of their remaining contract period, he would rebrand the unit the Greenhaven Gestapo. Sometime after this, the Greenhaven Gestapo would be employed by the RimWorld's Republic. Now, it isn't surprising to find someone of his demeanour to be noticed by Amaris and his inner circle. Antelos and his men were the type to get the job done with little complaint about the orders given, so long as they could go about it in their own vile way. It is rumoured that Antelos may have been one of the key architects of Operation Apotheosis, though this isn't confirmed, and others rightly suggest that he was still working actively as a mercenary around this time, and he'd yet to show any aptitude for planning such a complex operation. What is confirmed, however, is the sheer number of atrocities committed by the Greenhaven Gestapo, and some parts of Terra still feel the pain of these actions, even to this day.
Overhead, Vice Admiral Markevich led the dozen remaining SLM warships against the RimWorld's navy presence over Eastern Europe, the last significant concentration of hostile ships in orbit. Unfortunately, 3 European STS control centres had been brought online, giving the invaders a notable numbers advantage. Nevertheless, the Starleague crews weathered the storm, and at 0900 Terra Standard Time managed to destroy the last RWM warship in the area. Regrettably,